Welcome back, legends. You're at No Harry. Another incredible story awaits. What if St. Mungo's healer scanned Harry at age 4 and discovered Dumbledore implanted 11 control Horcruxes? Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1. The scan. The waiting room at St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries smelled like peppermint and something older underneath it, herbs that had no Muggle name, dried and crushed and burned into the walls over decades of use. The portraits on the walls showed famous healers in lime green robes, most of them frozen mid-gesture, pointing at diagrams of the human body that shifted and rearranged themselves whenever a patient walked past. At 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon in late July, the waiting room was moderately busy. A witch with a cactus growing out of her left ear sat reading Witch Weekly with studied calm. Two small boys were engaged in a fierce argument over a chocolate frog card while their mother tried to vanish a spreading purple stain from her robes. An elderly wizard kept nodding off and producing small, involuntary jets of flame from his nostrils each time his head dropped. Nobody paid much attention to the Muggle woman who came through the visitor's entrance with a small child pressed against her chest. Petunia Desley did not want to be here. That much was obvious to anyone who looked at her. The rigid set of her jaw, the way her eyes moved constantly around the room as though cataloging exits, the particular kind of white-knuckled determination that belongs to people doing something they have categorically decided they will never speak of again. She was thin and long-necked and wore a floral blouse that was slightly too cheerful for her expression, and she carried the child the way someone carries a problem they haven't yet solved. The child was 4 years old and very small for his age. He had dark hair that went in every direction at once, a thin face that should have had more roundness to it, and a pair of round glasses slightly too large for his face held together at the bridge with a piece of sellotape. One lens was cracked. He had a bruise along his left cheekbone that had gone the greenish yellow of something several days old, and the way he held his right arm, tucked against his body, careful and still, suggested it had been hurting for a while. His eyes were green. Startlingly, almost unnervingly green, the color of deep water with light moving through it. They moved around the waiting room with a quiet, methodical attention that didn't belong to most 4-year-olds, cataloging everything with a seriousness that sat oddly on such a small face. "Sit," Petunia said, depositing him in a chair near the door. She kept her voice low. "Don't touch anything. Don't talk to anyone. My arm, I know about your arm. That's why we're here." She sat beside him, handbag clutched in her lap. Quietly. The boy said nothing else. He watched the portrait of a healer from 1887 wave a thermometer cheerfully at him and waved back, a small automatic gesture, before catching himself and going still again. The welcome witch behind the desk was a heavy-set woman with magnificent eyebrows and an expression that suggested she had seen everything and judged most of it. Her name badge said EDNA. She looked up at Petunia when she approached the desk, then at the boy, and her magnificent eyebrows did something complicated. "Name?" she said. Petunia stopped. Swallowed. "Potter. Harry Potter." Edna's quill froze over her parchment. It was barely a pause, half a second, maybe less, but Petunia saw it and her chin went up another degree. "His arm," Petunia said, clipped and precise. "And he's been running a fever. That's all." Edna looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly professional. Then she wrote something on her parchment, tore off a slip, and held it out. "3rd floor. Pediatric ward. They'll call him through." Petunia took the slip and returned to her chair. The boy was watching the purple stain on the other woman's robes vanish in slow spirals, his expression one of careful, guarded fascination. They waited 20 minutes. The boy didn't fidget. He sat with his too careful arm in his lap and watched the room and didn't ask for anything. That, thought Edna from behind her desk, glancing over every few minutes, was not how 4-year-olds sat in waiting rooms. 4-year-olds squirmed and demanded biscuits and knocked things over. They did not sit like small statues with ancient eyes and wait. She picked up her interdepartmental communication pad and wrote a brief note to the pediatric ward. The healer who came out to collect Harry was a young man named Dawlish, not the Auror, a different one, a nervous recent graduate with good intentions and very clean robes, who introduced himself pleasantly and led them through a set of swinging double doors into a corridor that smelled even more strongly of herbs and something bright and antiseptic underneath. He asked Harry his name and Harry said it. He asked Harry how old he was and Harry said 4. He asked if Harry could tell him what happened to his arm and Harry looked at his aunt and his aunt looked at the wall, and after a moment Harry said, quietly, that he'd fallen. Dawlish wrote this down. His quill moved slowly. He settled them in an examination room, pale green walls, a narrow bed with a crisp white sheet, shelves of neatly labeled potion bottles, and did a preliminary assessment, quick and efficient, keeping up a gentle stream of conversation while his wand moved in careful diagnostic arcs over Harry's arm. The arm was broken. 2 small fractures in the radius, one slightly older than the other. Dawlish wrote that down too. His quill moved even more slowly this time. He excused himself, telling Petunia he was going to get a senior healer to look Harry over before they set the bone, because policy required a second opinion for pediatric fractures, which was true, and also because he needed approximately 90 seconds in the corridor to breathe carefully and decide what to do, which he did not mention. The senior healer on the pediatric ward that Thursday afternoon was Miriam Voss. She was 57 years old and had been working at St. Mungo's for 23 of them, before which she had spent 8 years as an Auror in the years leading up to and through Voldemort's first rise, and before that had trained under one of the finest diagnostic healers the wizarding world had produced in the last century. She was short, broad-shouldered, with white hair cut practically short and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and she had a face that had decided somewhere around age 45 to stop apologizing for anything. She read Dawlish's notes in the corridor with the expression of someone who had already suspected what they were reading. "How's the aunt?" she said. "Tense," said Dawlish. "Won't look directly at the boy." "Right." She folded the notes. "Go find the Edna's initial intake form and put it on my desk. I'll take it from here." She pushed open the examination room door. The first thing she noticed was that the boy was sitting on the edge of the bed, not lying down, not leaning back, sitting upright with both feet dangling above the floor, and he was looking directly at the door when she opened it, as though he'd heard her footsteps and timed it exactly. The second thing she noticed was the bruise. The third thing she noticed was his eyes, which were the particular green of old magic, deep water magic, the kind that ran in bloodlines that went back far enough to predate Hogwarts, and which were regarding her with a calm, assessing attention that she associated primarily with field Aurors and very old witches. "Hello," she said, pulling a stool over and sitting at his eye level. This was deliberate. She'd learned early in pediatrics that sitting down mattered more than almost anything else. "I'm Healer Voss. What's your name?" "Harry." "Harry. All right. I'm going to take a look at you, if that's okay." He considered this. "Will it hurt?" "The diagnostic spell won't hurt at all. Setting the bone later might pinch a bit, but we have a potion for that which tastes like pumpkin juice." "I've had pumpkin juice," he said, as though this was relevant information he was offering freely. "Good. Do I have your permission to do the scan?" He blinked. She had the impression this was not a question he'd been asked very often, permission, for anything. He nodded. She took her wand, 12 inches, hornbeam, dragon heartstring, worn smooth with use, and began the diagnostic sequence she'd done roughly 4,000 times in her career. It was a layered scan, the kind they used for children, moving through physical systems first, skeletal, muscular, cardiovascular, neurological. Standard, brisk, the results appearing as a soft golden light that mapped the body and fed impressions directly to the healer's trained mind. 2 fractures in the right radius, 1 fresh, 1 2 weeks old. 3 healed fractures in the left hand, all between 6 months and 2 years old. Malnutrition, caloric and protein deficiency, the kind that accumulates over years not days. An old head injury, the thin silver signature of concussion that had healed without treatment. Several large bruises in various stages of resolution. Miriam kept her face neutral. She had learned to do this. She was very good at it. She moved into the secondary scan, magical systems, core evaluation, the deep layer assessment they ran on magical children to check for developmental abnormalities or accidental damage. The golden light shifted. Deepened. Moved into the register she thought of as the water dark, the deep diagnostic frequency that read the actual magical core, the bright living center of a witch or wizard that grew like a heartbeat from birth. She found Harry's core. And she stopped. Her wand hand didn't waver, 23 years of professional practice, but something in her chest did, a lurch that was purely physical, the body's response to the mind encountering something that did not fit any existing category. Harry Potter's magical core was, she had no other word for it, extraordinary. Not in a vague, superlative sense. In a specific, clinical, measurable sense. It was dense and layered and moved with a quality she had seen only once before, in a very old healer she'd trained under who had been practicing magic for 70 years. It was a core that should not exist in a 4-year-old body. The sheer volume of it, the complexity of the channels it had already begun to develop, she had treated children from old magical families, had scanned the offspring of the most powerful witches and wizards of her generation, and she had never seen anything like this. But that wasn't what had stopped her. What had stopped her was what was wrapped around that core like ivy around a tree. 11 separate constructs. 11 distinct, deliberately placed, precisely engineered magical structures embedded at different points throughout Harry's core, his channels, his memory pathways, the delicate web of himself that made him him. They were not accidental. They were not the result of a curse or a hostile spell or a potion. They were intricate and patient and had clearly been placed with great care, the way a surgeon places stitches, methodical, thorough, designed to hold. They were suppressing his power output. Dampening emotional responses. Filtering memory formation. One of them, she had to look twice, because her mind tried to reject what she was seeing. One of them was specifically designed to influence the formation of loyalty and attachment, to direct it toward a particular external source like water directed through a channel. They were, she realized with a cold that started in her sternum and spread outward, Horcrux-adjacent constructs. Not full Horcruxes, they contained no piece of a separated soul, but they were built on the same fundamental architecture. Dark magic of extraordinary complexity and precision, from a practitioner who understood the theory at its deepest level. There was a signature on them. All 11. The same signature on all 11. She knew the signature. She'd felt it on ministry documents, on school correspondence, on the protective enchantments that had surrounded the original Order of the Phoenix headquarters during the war. She'd felt it at Hogwarts itself, woven into the wards, familiar as a landmark. She almost didn't complete the identification because some part of her did not want it confirmed. But she was Miriam Voss, and she had never once looked away from something because it was inconvenient, and she was not going to start with a 4-year-old boy sitting on an examination table in front of her with a broken arm and ancient eyes. She completed the identification. Albus Dumbledore. For a moment, she simply sat. The golden light of the scan still hung in the air between them. Harry was watching it with that same careful fascination he'd turned on the purple stain in the waiting room, tracking the light's movement with his eyes, and she thought distantly that he could probably see more of it than most children would, even suppressed as he was, even with 11 chains wrapped around that extraordinary core of his, he still perceived more than he was supposed to. "Healer Voss," he said. She realized she'd been silent too long. She let the diagnostic spell resolve and made a notation on her parchment that was precise and clinical and betrayed nothing. "Yes, love. Did you find something?" She looked at him. He was 4 years old. He had a broken arm and a healing bruise, and he had asked the question the way someone asks when they already half know the answer and are deciding whether or not to be frightened of it. She made a decision, there and then, of the kind she hadn't made since she'd left the Auror Corps. "I found a few things I want to take a closer look at," she said. "But first, let's deal with your arm, yeah. Then I need to speak to someone. Is that all right?" He nodded again. Serious. Taking it in. She gave him the pumpkin juice potion. He drank it without drama, made a face that suggested it tasted nothing like pumpkin juice, and set the bone with 2 clean spells that took 30 seconds and made him go very still and white around the mouth for a moment before the potion reached the pain and smoothed it away. There, she said. Done. You were very brave. He said nothing to that, and she wondered how many times in his short life bravery had been required and how little anyone had noticed. She wrapped his arm in a soft blue binding that would dissolve in 48 hours. Then she went to the door and leaned into the corridor and gestured to a passing healer, young woman, 2nd year, solid head on her shoulders. Amara. Can you sit with the boy in exam room 4 for a bit? Just keep him company. There are picture books in the cupboard. Amara looked at her expression and asked no questions. She was good people. Miriam walked down the corridor, turned left, went through the administrative door, and sat down at her desk. She pulled a piece of parchment toward her and picked up her quill. She put it down again. She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the London street below for about 30 seconds. Then she came back, sat down, and picked up the quill again. She wrote 2 communications. One to the head of pediatrics, brief and clinical, flagging a diagnostic finding requiring immediate departmental consultation. The other was on a different grade of parchment, heavier, watermarked with the ministry seal that she still had access to from her Aura days, that she'd kept in the bottom drawer for 7 years without ever needing it. She addressed it to Amelia Bones, Director of Magical Law Enforcement, and she marked it urgent, eyes only, and she wrote in it the clearest, most precise summary of what she had found that she was capable of producing, and it took her 14 minutes and 3 attempts to get it right because her hands kept wanting to shake and she wouldn't let them. Then she went back to exam room 4. Harry was sitting cross-legged on the bed with a picture book open in his lap, and Amara was sitting on the stool showing him how to make the illustrations move by tapping them with a finger. Harry was tapping each one methodically, watching it animate, and then moving to the next with an expression of focused interest. Amara caught Miriam's eye over his head and raised her eyebrows in a question. Miriam shook her head very slightly, which meant, not now. Harry, she said. I need to go and speak with your aunt for a minute. Will you be all right here with Amara? He looked up from the book. You said you found something. I did. Is it bad? She sat on the edge of the bed beside him, which was not standard healer protocol, and she said, There's something in your magic that shouldn't be there. We're going to look into it. I'm going to make sure you're looked after while we do. That's my job. He considered her for a long moment with those green eyes. Then he said, No one's told me the truth about things before. It was said without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. Pure observation. I'm telling you the truth, she said. I'll keep doing that. Another long look. He nodded, and turned back to the picture book, and tapped a small illustrated dragon so it breathed a jet of illustrated flame. He watched the flame with complete attention. Miriam stood and went to find Petunia Desley. She found her in the corridor outside, standing near the window at the end with her arms folded and her handbag strap twisted around her fingers. Petunia turned when she heard footsteps and opened her mouth for what was clearly going to be a remark about how long everything was taking. Mrs. Desley, Miriam said quietly. I need you to come and speak with me in my office. Petunia's face tightened. Is it just the arm? He'll be fine. This is about other things. Please come. She sat Petunia down across her desk and poured her a cup of tea from the pot she kept on the filing cabinet and said, Mrs. Desley, I'm going to be very direct with you, because I think we'll both find it faster. Petunia wrapped both hands around the tea. She didn't say anything. Harry's arm was broken in 2 places. One fracture was recent and one was approximately 2 weeks old. He has several other healed injuries consistent with repeated physical impact. He shows signs of nutritional deficiency over an extended period. She paused. I'm required by law to report all of this to the appropriate authority. I'm telling you this as a courtesy, not a negotiation. Petunia's face had gone very still. The particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation and is now in it. My husband, she began. I'm not here to hear about your husband, Miriam said, not unkindly but absolutely without flexibility. I'm here to tell you that Harry is going to remain here at St. Mungo's tonight, and possibly for several days, while we complete our assessment. You're welcome to provide us with contact details. That's all I need from you right now. Petunia set her tea down. Her jaw was working. He's a freak, she said, and then seemed to hear herself say it and looked at the wall. He's, like the rest of them. I never wanted, she stopped. Lily was my sister. She said it the way people say things they have spent years not saying, and the words came out stripped of all the careful revision she'd given them in her own head, bare and complicated and sad. I know, said Miriam, because she had read the war records, because the name Lily Potter was not unfamiliar to anyone who had been in the Order's orbit. I'm sorry about your sister. Petunia looked at her hands. He'll be safe here, Miriam said. I'll make sure of it personally. After Petunia left, walking quickly, not looking back, which Miriam found she couldn't entirely condemn, she returned to her own office and sat for a moment. The day outside her window had gone gray, clouds pulling in from the west. The city hummed and bled below, entirely unaware. She thought about 11 constructs built on Horcrux architecture, placed with surgical precision inside a 4-year-old. She thought about what it would take to place them. The knowledge required. The access. She thought about where Harry Potter had been for the past 3 years, since the night Voldemort had killed James and Lily Potter and the world had exhaled with relief and called a boy a savior. She thought about who had placed him there. Who had made that decision, had known where he was, had had consistent access to him without anyone questioning it, because who questioned Albus Dumbledore? The answer to all of those questions was the same name. Her office window looked east. The sky was turning the color of old pewter. And then, against the gray, something moved, a flash of gold and red at the glass, a brilliance that didn't belong to the fading afternoon, there and gone so fast she almost thought she'd imagined it. She hadn't. She'd seen a phoenix before, once, from a distance, during the war. You didn't forget the quality of that light. She didn't know what to make of it. She filed it away, which was what she did with things that didn't fit yet. She went back to Harry. He had finished with the picture book and was now sitting very quietly with his eyes closed. Amara gave her a slightly worried look and Miriam shook her head again. He's all right, and Amara gathered up the books and slipped out. Miriam sat on the stool. Harry. He opened his eyes. The green of them, in the room's soft lighting, was almost painful. My aunt left, he said. She did. You're going to stay here with us for a few days. We've got proper beds, proper food, the works. He processed this. I'm not going back to Privet Drive. Not tonight. She held his gaze. How do you feel? Right now. Honestly. He thought about it with a seriousness she'd have expected from someone 3 times his age. Like everything is very far away, he said finally. Like when you're watching telly in another room and you can hear it but you can't quite, he stopped, frowning. Like there's something in the way. Miriam kept her face very calm and her hands very still. Does it always feel like that? She said. I don't know what else it feels like. She nodded. She stood and moved to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the street, giving herself 3 seconds that she absolutely needed. Then she turned back. Harry, she said, has anyone ever done a magical scan on you before? Before today? I don't know what that is. What I did with my wand. When the gold light, oh. He thought about it. No. Aunt Petunia doesn't like, he stopped again, adjusting. No. All right. She came and sat back down. Has anyone ever talked to you about your magic? About what you can do? He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, a careful, practiced blankness that 4-year-olds had no business being capable of. I'm not supposed to do it. You're not supposed to show it. I'm not supposed to do it, he repeated, and the distinction in his phrasing was so precise, so deliberate, that she understood, he'd learned to frame it that way. Not to talk about it as suppressed. To talk about it as wrong. As something that was his fault. 11 constructs, she thought. All that work. And still the boy was clearly perceiving, clearly feeling, clearly bumping up against his own edges constantly. Whatever they'd been meant to suppress had simply been too much to fully contain. You couldn't put an ocean in a jar. You could only make the jar very small and hope the ocean didn't notice how much of itself was left outside. Your magic, she said carefully, is yours. It belongs to you. And it's been, she paused, choosing words. We found something during the scan. Something that's been making it harder to feel. Like a wall around it. He looked at her. We're going to take the wall down, she said. But we need to be careful about how we do it. It's going to take some time, and we're going to do it safely, and I'm going to be here the whole time. All right? He was quiet for a long moment. She let the silence sit. Who put it there, he said. God, she thought. 3 years old, 4 years old, no education, no context, barely fed, and he immediately cut straight to the right question. She said, I don't know yet. Which was true. She knew the signature. She didn't know the why, and without the why she had nothing to tell him that wouldn't leave more questions than it answered. He seemed to accept this. He looked down at his wrapped arm, flexing his fingers experimentally. It doesn't hurt, he said, sounding faintly surprised. Good. That's the potion working. Let me know if it comes back. He nodded. He looked up at her again. You're going to make sure I'm looked after. You said. I said. People say things. I know they do. She met his eyes. I'm not most people. He looked at her for a long moment, measuring, weighing, doing calculations she couldn't see, and something in his expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, not fully, but the first careful precursor to it. The opening of a possibility. Okay, he said. She got him settled in a proper bed on the pediatric ward, private room, because she pulled rank without a second thought, with a proper dinner that she ordered from the kitchen specifically rather than from the standard tray, because she'd seen the scan and she knew what 3 years of malnutrition looked like and she wanted protein and vegetables and things that were warm. He ate methodically and completely, which told her everything she needed to know about what mealtimes at Privet Drive had looked like. She sat with him until he fell asleep, which didn't take long. He was exhausted in the deep-down way that had nothing to do with one day's tiredness and everything to do with sustained deprivation over years. When she was sure he was asleep, she stood, and smoothed the blanket at the edge of the bed in a gesture that surprised herself slightly, and went back to her office. The urgent communication she'd sent to Amelia Bones had generated a response. It was brief, which was typical of Amelia, and said, "Confirm what you found. I need to see the full diagnostic record. I'll be there at 7 tomorrow morning. Don't discuss this with anyone else." Miriam sent a confirming reply and began preparing the full diagnostic record, every measurement, every observed characteristic of the 11 constructs, the complete magical signature identification, annotated clearly with the specificity of an Auror's case report. She worked until 11:30. The hospital quieted around her, the day shift filtering out and the night staff taking over with their quieter rhythms. At some point she made herself a fresh cup of tea and stood at her window while it steeped. The city was lit up, orange and white, and she thought about a girl named Lily Evans who had grown up in a Muggle town and gone to Hogwarts and become one of the finest charm workers of her generation, who had laughed loudly at bad jokes and hexed anyone who tried to bully her friends, who had married James Potter and had a son with green eyes and died at 21 to save him. She thought about what Lily Potter would say if she could see her son now. She thought she had a fairly good idea. It involved quite a lot of colorful language and, at the end of it, a very specific name said in a very specific tone. She finished her tea. She went back to work. On the pediatric ward, Harry Potter slept in a real bed with a real pillow and a warm blanket, and if something in the deep part of him sensed, dimly, through all 11 layers of installed constriction, that something had shifted today, that for the first time in his short and mostly unkind life someone had looked directly at what was being done to him and said no, this stops, it showed only in the way his sleeping face, which had been so carefully still all day, finally relaxed into something that looked, at last, like a child's rest. At the window of his room, very briefly, the quality of the night light changed. Something golden and warm. There and gone. Miriam, walking past in the corridor, stopped and looked through the small window in the door. The light had already faded. But Harry was sleeping easily, and she allowed herself to think that maybe that meant something. She went home at midnight and set her alarm for 5:30 and did not sleep well, because she kept seeing 11 constructs in her mind's eye, patient and precise, and thinking about all the things they had been put there to prevent. The case file on her desk was labeled, in her clear Auror's handwriting, Potter, H., Diagnostic Anomaly, Urgent. She had not yet written the full name of the signature source in any document. She would, in the morning, with Amelia Bones in the room, as a witness. She would write it cleanly and precisely and hand it across the desk and watch Amelia's face. But she knew it already, and as she drove home through the quiet streets of magical London, it sat in her chest like something she'd swallowed that hadn't gone down quite right. Albus Dumbledore. All the chess pieces. All the planning. The boy on the board, moved carefully into position, stitched up with invisible thread and placed where he could be retrieved when the time was right. She'd left the Auror Corps because she'd seen too many children broken by the war. She'd thought, perhaps naively, that the war was over. She pulled into her drive, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the dark. Then she went inside, made another cup of tea she didn't drink, and started writing notes for the morning. Harry woke twice in the night, once at 2, reaching automatically for the cupboard wall that wasn't there, confused by the softness under him, and both times a night shift healer came quickly and quietly and checked on him and asked if he needed anything, and both times he said no and lay back down and looked at the ceiling of a room that was large and warm and did not have a lock on the outside of his door. The second time he woke, around 4 in the morning, he lay on his back with his good arm behind his head and thought about the thing the healer Voss had said. A wall around it. Something making it harder to feel. He thought about the muffled quality of everything, the way the world always seemed to be reaching him slightly late, the way sometimes when he felt something, fear, mostly, or the occasional bright spike of wonder at something interesting, it arrived blunted, like sound through heavy cloth. He'd always assumed that was just what feeling was. That everyone experienced it that way. He thought about the way the room had looked when she'd done the scan. The gold light, moving. The way some of it had seemed to catch and cluster around him in places, like it was meeting resistance. He'd watched it and thought, with a child's instinctive logic, that it looked like something stuck. Something put there. He was 4 years old. He didn't have words for all of what he was thinking, but the structure of the thought was there, clear and simple. Someone had put something in him. The healer had found it. The healer was going to take it out. He thought, who? He thought, why? He didn't have answers. But the questions sat there, bright and clean, and he held them carefully, because they were his, and he was beginning to understand, dimly, the way you understand things at the very edge of being able to understand them, that there were not many things that were only his. At 5 in the morning, the pediatric ward began its slow morning chorus, the subtle shift from night sounds to day sounds, the first trolley in a corridor, the changing of the ward lights from their overnight amber to the brighter white blue of waking hours. Harry Potter lay in his bed and waited for the day, which was something he was very practiced at. Outside his window, London moved from dark to grey to the first thin suggestion of morning gold. He watched it happen, which was also something he was practiced at, and thought that for the first time in his memory, he was curious about what came next rather than afraid of it. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. Chapter 2, Removal. Amelia Bones arrived at St. Mungo's at 6:53 in the morning, which was 7 minutes early, which was exactly like her. She was a square-jawed woman in her early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and a monocle she wore not because she needed it for vision but because it contained a built-in verification charm that identified forgeries and lies in written documents. She wore ministry robes of deep burgundy and carried a dragonhide briefcase that had been with her through 3 administrations and 2 wars and showed it. She moved through the visitor's entrance like someone who owned the building, not arrogantly, just with the absolute assurance of a person who has been in charge of difficult situations for long enough that the habit of authority has become indistinguishable from posture. Miriam was waiting at the main desk with 2 cups of tea and the complete diagnostic file under her arm. She handed Amelia a cup without preamble and said, "My office." They walked. Amelia read as she walked, which was a skill she developed out of necessity and which made junior ministry staff deeply nervous. By the time they reached Miriam's office she had read 14 pages of the file. She sat down, set her tea on the desk, and read the remaining 6 pages in silence. Miriam sat across from her and drank her own tea and did not rush her. Amelia set the file down. She removed her monocle and polished it on her sleeve, which Miriam recognized as her thinking gesture, the thing she did when she needed the time. "You're certain about the signature identification," Amelia said. "It's in the appendix. Full spectral analysis, cross-referenced against 3 independent baseline samples." "Where did you get the baseline samples?" "Ministry documents that carry his personal warding signature. Hogwarts admissions records. A letter he sent to the hospital 3 years ago regarding a patient whose name I won't mention. I asked the records department for publicly available examples and I did not tell them why." She paused. "All 3 match. The confidence interval is 98.7%. Amelia put her monocle back in. She looked at the file again. 11, she said. 11. In a 4-year-old. Yes. Amelia was quiet for a moment. Outside, the hospital was waking up properly, voices in corridors, the rattle of breakfast trolleys, the particular managed bustle of a large medical institution starting its day. She seemed not to hear any of it. "How is the boy?" she said. "Physically, he's going to be fine." The arms set. "Nutritional deficiency will resolve with proper feeding, 2 weeks, maybe 3. The older injuries are healed." She held Amelia's gaze. "Emotionally, I don't have a full picture yet. He's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A traumatized 4-year-old. Which he is, underneath. But on top of that," she searched for the right word. "He's very contained. Very watchful. He asked exactly the right questions and didn't make a fuss. He's been managing himself for a long time." "Because of the constructs?" "Partly. They damp emotional response, you can see it in the diagnostic, the limbic suppression is quite precise. But some of it is just, him. His actual character, coming through despite everything." She paused. "Amelia. His core. Before you look at any of the rest of it, look at the core measurements on page 3. Amelia flipped back. She read the measurements. Then she read them again. "This is accurate," she said. "I ran it 4 times. Amelia set the file flat on the desk and pressed both palms against it, which was not something Miriam had ever seen her do before. For a moment she looked less like the director of magical law enforcement and more like a woman confronting something that rearranged too many things at once. "We need to remove them," Miriam said. "The constructs. Medically, legally, ethically, there's no question. The question is how and when. Is it dangerous? Unknown. We don't have a precedent for this exact architecture. I've consulted overnight with the Department of Mysteries, anonymously, framed as a hypothetical, and the response was that removal of Horcrux-adjacent constructs from a living magical core is theoretically possible but requires extraordinary care. They could be load-bearing. Amelia looked up. Load-bearing. Meaning they may have been integrated into his magical development over 3 years to the point where removing them too fast could damage the channels they're attached to. Like removing a splint from a bone that's grown around it. She picked up her tea. Or they could come out cleanly and leave him entirely intact. I won't know until I look more closely. Who can do it? Ideally. Me. I'm the best diagnostic healer this hospital has for pediatric magical anomalies, and I did my Aura training in dark artifact removal. She said it simply, not as a boast. I'll want a second pair of hands for safety. Thaddeus Wren from our curse-breaking unit. He's worked on dark mark residuals, he understands the architecture. Amelia nodded slowly. And the custody question. While the boy is here, he's under hospital jurisdiction for now. Mandatory safeguarding protocol. The Muggle relatives won't be making decisions about his care. Miriam's voice didn't change. I want to make that permanent. That's a Wisengamot matter. Magical guardianship. I know what it is. She looked at Amelia directly. I'm prepared to petition for temporary medical guardianship through the hospital, which is within our authority under the Child Magical Welfare Act. Long term, yes, it needs the Wisengamot. But we can establish a framework before this becomes public. Amelia was quiet for a long moment. The morning light through the window was gaining strength, turning the office's clutter of files and potion bottles to gold. When you take this to the Wisengamot, Amelia said carefully, the name on those constructs becomes a matter of record. Yes. You understand what that means. Who that is. I do. Amelia stood and picked up her briefcase and her tea and walked to the window. She stood with her back to Miriam for a moment. You were an Auror, she said. 8 years. And now you've found this. She turned. What do you want to do, Miriam? Not officially. Not procedurally. What do you actually want to do? Miriam set her cup down very carefully on its saucer. I want to get 11 dark constructs out of a 4-year-old boy, she said. And then I want to watch the man who put them there answer for it in a room full of people he can't manage. Amelia looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and picked up the diagnostic file. Do the removal, she said. I'll begin building the case. They prepared for 3 days. Miriam spent those 3 days doing 2 things, preparing the removal procedure in meticulous detail, and getting to know Harry Potter. The second one was not clinically required. She did it anyway. She brought him books, not picture books, but proper books, magical theory simplified for young readers, books about creatures and plants and the history of the world he'd barely been allowed to know he belonged to. He went through them with the focused appetite of someone who has been hungry for a long time and has finally been pointed at a kitchen. He asked good questions. Not all of them were questions she expected. On the first morning he read half a book about magical creatures and then looked up and said, "Why are nifflers illegal in mainland Britain? They dig up Muggle property and leave magical evidence. Import control. But they're not hurting anyone. Laws aren't always about hurt," she said. Sometimes they're about inconvenience. He considered this with the same gravity he applied to everything. That seems like a bad reason. It is. A lot of laws have bad reasons. When you're older you can argue about it. Will I be able to argue? With the way your mind works, I'd be amazed if anyone could stop you. The smallest, most carefully rationed ghost of a smile. Gone before she could be sure she'd seen it. On the second day she came in at lunchtime and found him attempting to levitate a piece of bread using only concentration and will, no wand, no instruction. He was 4. He was doing it. The bread was hovering about 3 centimeters above his lunch tray, wobbling, while he stared at it with narrowed eyes. It collapsed when he noticed her, and he looked slightly embarrassed, which was the most normal 4-year-old thing he'd done since he arrived. "Don't stop," she said. "I'm not supposed to. You're supposed to eat your lunch. The magic can happen at the same time." She sat down. "Have you done things like that before? At home?" He looked at the bread. "Things happen. I don't always do them on purpose." "What kinds of things?" He thought about it for a while. "Once I was on the roof of the school. I didn't know how I got there." He said it carefully, like he was still deciding whether it was something he was allowed to admit. "Another time Dudley's gang was chasing me and I ended up on the other side of the bins." "Disapparition," she said. "Accidental. Very rare in someone your age." He looked at her. "Is that bad?" "It's impressive. Eat your lunch." He ate. He also, without seeming to think about it, levitated the bread again and took a bite while it was in the air, which made the night shift healer who had come to check on him stop in the doorway and blink several times. On the third day Miriam sat down with him and explained, as clearly as she could, what was going to happen. She'd been going back and forth on how much to tell him. Eventually she decided, all of it. Age-appropriate framing, honest content. He deserved it. "We're going to do a procedure tomorrow," she said. "It's not an operation, we won't need to cut anything. We'll be working with magic." He was listening with his full attention. "The things I found in your magical core, the constructs, we're going to remove them one by one, very carefully. Each one we take out might feel like something. I don't know exactly what. It might feel like pressure releasing. It might feel strange or overwhelming for a moment. We're going to go slowly." She paused. "There are 11 of them. Depending on how it goes, we might do all of them in one session, or we might spread it out over a few days. Will it hurt? Honestly? I don't know. I'm going to try very hard to make sure it doesn't. But I want to be truthful with you." He nodded. He'd told her once, in passing, that he preferred it when people said they didn't know to when they pretended they did. She'd tucked that away. "What happens when they come out?" he said. "Your magic will probably feel different. Bigger, maybe. Less muffled. You said it feels like something is in the way. That should change." He was quiet. "Then, what if I can't control it? When it's bigger? We'll teach you. That's what Hogwarts is for, among other things. And between now and then, we'll work on it. You won't be on your own." He looked at his hands. He had thin hands, bony-knuckled, the kind that would be elegant when he was older. "You keep saying we," he said. "I do. Who's we?" "Me, for starters." She held his gaze steadily. "And some other good people. People who are going to be very angry about what was done to you and very motivated to make sure you're all right." He processed this for a long moment. "The person who put them there," he said, very carefully. "Do you know who it is now?" She'd known this question was coming. She'd prepared for it. "I have a strong idea. I can't tell you yet, not because I want to keep things from you, but because there's a process that has to happen, and if it goes wrong I don't want you to have been told things that ended up not being handled right." It wasn't the full truth. The full truth was that she was protecting him from knowledge that, once he had it, she couldn't predict the effects of. Not because she thought he couldn't handle it, but because he was 4 years old and she was not going to put the name of his betrayer in him before she could give him something to do with it. He seemed to understand this, or at least to accept it. "All right," he said. That night Miriam went over the procedure for the last time with Thaddeus Wren, who was a compact, careful man of 40 with the specific kind of unflappable calm that came from spending 12 years defusing dark artifacts in various dangerous locations. He read her procedure notes and said, "This is excellent work," which from Thaddeus was a speech. "The 4th and 7th constructs worry me," she said, spreading the diagnostic illustrations across his workbench. "They're embedded in the primary channel junctions. If there's any scar tissue around the attachment points, I've worked around scar tissue on a live core before. It's delicate but it's manageable. He studied the fourth construct's illustrated architecture. Who built this? She said nothing. He looked at her. He was not a stupid man. Someone very good, he said finally. Someone who understood the architecture at a deep level. Yes. Dark magic isn't incompatible with intelligence. No, she agreed. It never has been. He gathered the notes. Tomorrow at 9. We'll be fine. She drove home and ate something she didn't taste and went to bed and lay on her back in the dark and thought about all the things that could go wrong, and then she thought about Harry on the examination table on the first day, watching the golden light of the diagnostic move through him with those ancient green eyes, and she stopped cataloging the things that could go wrong and started thinking instead about what it was going to look like when the last construct came out. She wasn't sure. But she thought it was going to be something. She slept 4 hours and woke before her alarm. The procedure room was on the 4th floor, separate from the wards, a large, quiet room that had been used for complex curse removal for 40 years and had an ambient magical stabilization field built into its walls that Miriam had always found faintly audible, a very low hum that she associated with safety. The room smelled like the rest of the hospital but cleaner, if that was possible. She'd had the night staff bring in a better lamp and a warmer blanket and a chair that was the right height for a 4-year-old. Harry came in holding a book. He seemed to always have one now, tucked under his arm or clutched in one hand, like a talisman, wearing the small pajamas the hospital had provided and his 2 large glasses and an expression of controlled, deliberate calm. You came prepared, Miriam said, nodding at the book. In case I have to wait. That's sensible. You might not need it, but it's good thinking. She settled him in the chair. Thaddeus is my colleague. He's very good and very quiet. He won't chat much, but that doesn't mean he's not paying attention. Thaddeus, standing by the materials table, raised a hand in a small wave. Harry studied him for a moment and apparently concluded he was trustworthy, because he nodded once and turned back to Miriam. I'm going to start with a full diagnostic again, same as before, so I can see exactly where we are, she said. And then we'll begin with the outermost construct. The one that's most accessible. We'll go one at a time. If at any point you want to stop, you say stop, and we stop. Yes. Okay. How are you feeling? He thought about it. Genuinely considered the question, as he always did. Like before a test at school, he said. When you know you've prepared but you don't know the questions yet. Nervous but ready. I suppose. That's a good way to be. She picked up her wand. Ready? He put his book on the small table beside him and folded his hands in his lap and said, yes. She ran the full diagnostic. The 11 constructs appeared in the golden light just as before, each one a distinct shape, identifiable by now from her 3 days of study. She'd given them designations in her notes, clinical and neutral, letters and numbers. A through K, structured by accessibility and risk. She planned to go A through K, simplest to most complex, though she knew the plan might shift. Construct A, she said to Thaddeus, who picked up his wand and moved to position. Construct A was the outermost, closest to the surface of Harry's magical field, a broad, relatively simple structure whose primary function was the dampening of external magical perception, specifically designed to make him less visible to other magical senses. A camouflage, essentially. She'd been angry about this one from the moment she'd identified it, because it explained why nobody had looked too closely at Harry Potter for 3 years. It had been making him difficult to see. She worked slowly, feeling along the edges of the construct with the fine focus spell she developed for this kind of work. It was attached at 3 points, shallow roots, and when she began to ease the first attachment free she felt Harry go very still in the chair. All right? She murmured. It's cold, he said, surprised. That might be the magic releasing. Keep breathing. She eased the second attachment. The third. And then, with a delicacy that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with precision, she lifted Constructa free. It came out like a splinter comes out, the moment of resistance and then the sudden ease, and resolved into a drift of dark smoke that Thaddeus caught with a containment spell, sealed in a glass vial, and labeled. Harry made a sound. Short, involuntary, not quite a gasp. Harry. He stopped. He was looking at his hands. I can feel the room, he said. I could feel the room before but now I can really feel it. He turned his head, looking at the walls, the door, the table of materials. She watched him sense the ambient magical field in the room, the low hum of the stabilization charm, things that had been background noise a moment ago suddenly coming in sharp and clear. It's louder, he said. Everything is louder. That's going to keep happening, she said. Each one we remove, more comes in. It might be a lot. You tell me if it's too much. He turned back to her. His eyes were very bright. It's not too much. It's just, he seemed unable to find a word for it. It's interesting, he said finally, which made Thaddeus make a very small sound that might have been a laugh quickly suppressed. All right, said Miriam. Construct B. They went through the morning systematically. B came out cleanly, releasing a surge of suppressed emotional processing that made Harry go quiet for several minutes while he apparently felt several things at once with the concentrated attention of someone who had been rationed on feeling for years. He didn't cry. He sat very still with his hands gripped in his lap and worked through it and came out the other side with a slightly dazed expression that gradually resolved into something clearer. C was the memory dampener, the construct that had been filtering his memory formation, ensuring that nothing he experienced would consolidate too strongly, that vivid impressions would blur and the sharp edges of his life would stay soft. When it came out, he flinched. Hard. His whole body jerked in the chair and his hands flew to the arms of it and gripped, white-knuckled. Harry, I remember things, he said, in a voice that was about 2 sizes too small. Things I didn't know I'd forgotten. Take your time. He sat with his eyes closed for almost 4 minutes. Miriam watched the diagnostic light shift as the memory channels opened, consolidated pathways becoming active that had been damned for years. She could see the information rushing through, 3 years of selectively suppressed memory suddenly available to him all at once. She watched his face move through several things she couldn't name. When he opened his eyes, they were still green and still steady, but the quality of them had changed. He looked older. Not in a sad way. In the way that people look when they have recovered something they didn't know they'd lost. My mum used to sing, he said. I didn't remember that. Miriam didn't say anything. She kept her face very, very calm. It was the same song a few times, he said. I don't know what it was called. He paused. I remember her now. Her face. I didn't before. Is that all right? Miriam said quietly. He thought about it. It's sad, he said, with the clinical accuracy of someone examining an emotion carefully. But yes. It's all right. He released the arms of the chair and straightened his back. Can we keep going? D, E, and F went in the next hour. D was the loyalty channel construct, the one that had been designed to redirect his natural bonding instinct, to keep it pointed outward and upward toward a specific external source rather than allowing him to form authentic attachments. When it came out, Miriam felt the release from across the room, a shimmer in the magical field that made the air briefly smell like rain, and Harry sat quietly for a long moment and then said, very conversationally, I think I've been wanting to trust people all along. I just couldn't quite get there. No, said Miriam. You couldn't. That's also interesting, he said, with a composure that made her chest ache. E was simpler, a general power suppression construct, the workhorse of E11, the one that had been doing the heavy lifting of keeping his magical output within what might pass for an unremarkable level. When it came out, the room changed. The ambient stabilization field, which had been a low hum all morning, spiked sharply. Every vial on Thaddeus's table rattled. The lamp in the corner flared and settled. Harry's hair, already perpetually untidy, performed a brief and enthusiastic attempt to escape his head entirely. And the golden diagnostic light went brilliant, genuinely, startlingly brilliant, flooding the room like someone had opened a shutter. Thaddeus looked at the readings on his diagnostic pad. Miriam looked at them too. "I did say the core measurements were exceptional," she said. "You did," said Thaddeus. "I assumed you were rounding up." He studied the readings. "You were rounding down." Harry, sitting in the center of this, looked at both of them. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing at all," said Miriam. He narrowed his eyes at her. "You're doing the thing where you sound calm when you're not. You're very perceptive. You've been very obvious." He looked down at his hands. "I can feel more," he said. "Much more." Like the volume went up again, but this time for everything. "My own," he turned his hands over, examining them as though something visible should have changed. "I can feel my own magic. It's very big." "It is," she agreed. "And it's entirely yours." He looked up at her. Something moved across his face, complicated and young and ferocious all at once, and she recognized it as the specific expression of someone realizing, for the first time, that they have always been more than they were allowed to be. They took a break. Miriam had the kitchen send up lunch and insisted Harry eat all of it before they continued, which he did, eating with the same methodical focus he brought to everything, and asking Thaddeus questions about curse-breaking that Thaddeus answered with the brevity of a man who took children seriously and therefore didn't condescend to them. "What's the most complicated thing you've ever removed?" Harry asked. "A full Horcrux fragment from a cursed locket," said Thaddeus. Harry considered this. "What's a Horcrux?" Thaddeus looked at Miriam. Miriam looked at the ceiling briefly. "It's an object a dark wizard uses to store a piece of their soul," she said. "It's very dark magic. Very complicated. Is that what's in me?" She'd been careful, every time this got close, to be honest. "Not exactly. The constructs in you are built on a similar architecture, the same understanding of how dark magic interacts with a magical core. But they don't contain a soul piece. They're different. But someone who knew how to make one could have made what's in me." "Yes," she said. He ate his lunch and didn't ask anything else for a while. Constructs G and H in the afternoon were the most technically demanding so far. G was woven through the primary channel junction she'd worried about, and she spent 40 minutes on it with the patience of someone diffusing something that genuinely needed diffusing. Thaddeus was perfectly positioned, perfectly timed, and they worked together with the easy efficiency of people who trusted each other's competence. G came out in 3 pieces, each one separately contained, and Harry made no sound at all, but the blood left his face for about 30 seconds and then came back. "Okay," Miriam said. "Yes," he said, with the absolute certainty of someone who has decided they are fine and would like everyone to agree with this assessment. H was easier. When it came out, Harry laughed. He looked as surprised by this as anyone. It was a short laugh, sharp and involuntary, like something escaping, and then he clapped a hand over his mouth and looked at them both with enormous eyes. "Sorry," he said. "I don't know why. What does it feel like?" said Miriam, genuinely curious. He lowered his hand. He was smiling now, small and wondering. "Like I told a joke and nobody laughed and then they finally did," he said. "Like, relief. That's a funny shape for relief." "What was Construct H?" Thaddeus asked. "Humor suppression," she said. "Specifically, the kind of humor that comes from finding things absurd." She looked at Harry. "Someone decided you shouldn't laugh too much." He looked at her steadily. "Someone decided a lot of things." "Yes," she said. "They did." I and J she had debated doing the next day. They were the deepest, most integrated constructs, the ones she'd identified as highest risk. But Harry was holding up extraordinarily well, the magical field was stable, and he looked at her when she suggested waiting and said, "Let's finish it." Not asked. Said. She and Thaddeus exchanged a look. "All right," she said. "I was the most complex single construct, a multi-layered structure embedded at the center of his primary emotional processing pathways, and she understood when she was in the middle of it what it had been designed to do, not merely to suppress, but to shape. To create a specific emotional disposition. Sacrifice-ready. Self-effacing. Willing to give without receiving. A particular kind of character, cultivated by preventing the development of an alternative." She kept her face absolutely neutral while she worked. When it came out, the room went very quiet. The stabilization field spiked again and then settled. Harry sat for a full 2 minutes without speaking or moving, and she didn't push him, just watched and waited and kept the diagnostic light steady. Then he looked up, and she saw something in his face that she couldn't entirely name, sharp and awake and somehow more itself than it had been an hour ago, like a signal that had been scrambled finally coming in clear. "I'm angry," he said, very quietly. Not at her. Not at anything in the room. At the fact of it. "I think I've been angry for a long time and I didn't know." "That's all right," she said. "Is it?" "It's completely appropriate," she said, "and I'd be deeply concerned if you weren't." He looked at his hands again. The light in the room was moving around him the way it had been all afternoon, the diagnostic field bending slightly toward him, the magical stabilization field's ambient hum having shifted half a register up as his core had opened, the air in the room carrying a quality she associated with thunderstorms and old magic. "One more," she said. He looked up. "K," she said. "The last one." Construct K was the one she'd identified at the very beginning and then put to the back of her mind because she needed to approach it last, when everything else was clear. It was the smallest of the 11, geometrically, the most compact, the most elegant, embedded at the deepest point of his core, at the seat of his magical identity, in the part of him that would become, as he grew, the foundation of everything he was capable of. It was a leash. That was the only honest word for it. A control point, built into the bedrock, designed to allow the person who had placed it to exercise a fundamental influence over Harry's magical core from a distance if they chose to invoke it. They had not yet invoked it. But it was there, and it was patient, and it had been patient for 3 years. Miriam worked around its edges with the finest precision she had, moving slowly, testing each attachment point, breathing steadily, aware of Thaddeus's absolute stillness behind her and the way the diagnostic light had gone very, very quiet, as though the room itself was paying attention. She found the first anchor point and began to ease it free. Harry made no sound. She found the second and the third and the fourth and worked each one carefully loose, the whole construct groaning against her spell like something that had been there for a long time and had grown accustomed to its position. She found the fifth anchor point. Beneath her wand, the construct's connection to the deepest level of Harry's core was vivid and dark and enormously complex, and she could see, actually, in the diagnostic light, the full scope of the control it represented, and she was briefly, genuinely furious in a way she hadn't let herself be all morning, because it was not until you were this close, this deep, that you truly understood what it had meant to put this in a child. She freed the fifth anchor. The construct came loose with a sound she felt more than heard, a low, deep release, like a bowstring finally cut, and then Thaddeus caught it and she straightened up and the room breathed. That was the only word for it. The room breathed. The stabilization field went to a frequency she'd never heard before and the diagnostic light blazed, white and gold, and Harry had his eyes closed and both hands pressed flat on his knees and he was very, very still, and the air around him was moving slightly, disturbed by nothing physical, lifting his hair and making the corners of his blanket shift. The light settled. The air settled. Harry opened his eyes. They were still green. They would always be green. But they were fully open now in a way they hadn't been before, like shutters pulled back on a room that turned out to be much larger than the outside of the building had suggested. Alert and present and fully, unambiguously his own. He looked at Miriam. He looked at Thaddeus. He looked at his hands. "Oh," he said quietly. And then, with the scientific composure of someone who has just discovered something remarkable, "That's quite a lot." "Yes," said Miriam. "Is this," he paused, feeling for words. "Is this what it's supposed to feel like? This is what you feel like?" Without interference. She set her wand on the table. Her hands were steady. She was very proud of her hands right now. "This is you." He looked at his hands for a long time. He turned them over, turned them back. He looked at the vials on Thaddeus's table, 11 of them in a row, each containing a drift of dark smoke that was already beginning to dissipate, curling against the glass. "The old man put them there," he said. Not a question. Very calm. Very steady. She stared at him. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "Who has access to children who nobody questions? Who would know this kind of magic? Who placed me with the Dursleys and made sure nobody looked too carefully at where I was?" He looked at her. "You said you had a strong idea. I've had 3 days to think about it and I've arrived at the same place. I want to know if I'm right." She was silent for a moment. "Albus Dumbledore," he said. "Isn't it?" It was not a question. Miriam breathed in. She looked at Thaddeus, who was studying the middle distance with elaborate attention. She looked back at Harry. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He looked at the row of vials again. "All 11. He was quiet for almost a minute, and she let the minute go by, and when he looked up his expression was not devastated, not collapsed, not the face of a child who has been told something unbearable. It was thoughtful. It was precise. It was, she realized with a chill of recognition, the face of someone deciding what to do next. "All right," he said. "What happens now?" She looked at him, 4 years old, thin-faced, wrapped in a hospital blanket, his broken arm in its soft blue binding, his enormous glasses held together with sellotape, and thought about all the things that were now set in motion that could not be unmoved, all the forces that were going to be brought to bear on this case, all the powerful and comfortable people whose worlds were going to be disrupted. She thought about what it was going to look like, in a Wisengamot chamber, when the evidence was laid out and the name was read. She thought about what it was going to look like, in a few years, when this boy was truly himself and fully formed and came to that chamber not as evidence but as himself. She thought, this is the beginning of something very large. Now, she said, some people are going to be very surprised. And not in a pleasant way. She picked up her wand. "But first, how's your arm feeling? And are you hungry? Because you just had 11 dark constructs removed from your magical core and you burned roughly the magical equivalent of running a very long race, and regardless of what comes next you are going to eat dinner." He blinked. He seemed to check in with his body, which had clearly been low on his list of priorities during the last hour. "My arm's fine," he said. "And, yes. Actually very hungry." "Good," she said. "We'll start there." She sent Thaddeus to the kitchen with instructions. She pulled up a chair and sat across from Harry, and for a few minutes they simply sat together in the room where 11 chains had just been broken, the evening light coming in golden through the high windows, the vials on the table behind them holding their small clouds of dissipating dark, and Harry looked out at the evening and seemed to be taking careful stock of what it felt like to be entirely, for the first time, himself. The room hummed with it. Thaddeus came back with 2 trays. He set one in front of Harry and one in front of Miriam and sat down with his own, and they ate in the specific comfortable silence of people who have done something difficult together and come out the other side, and outside the hospital windows London moved through its evening, entirely unaware that something significant had just shifted in its midst. Harry ate everything on his tray. He ate quickly, with the focused efficiency of someone who had just realized they were ravenous, and when he finished he set his fork down and straightened up and looked at Miriam with those fully open green eyes. "When do we talk to the people who are going to be very surprised?" he said. "Soon," she said. "First you sleep. Then we plan. He considered this. How soon is soon? A few days. All right. He picked up his book. He'd had it under the chair this whole time, she realized, kept close throughout the entire afternoon. I'll be ready. She looked at him. She thought, I believe you completely. I know you will, she said. Chapter 3, The Reckoning. 4 years is a long time to build a case. Amelia Bones built it anyway, because she was the kind of person who, once she decided something needed doing, did it with the patience of someone who understood that the most important things rarely moved quickly. She built it the way she'd built every major case in her career, methodically, without shortcuts, without gaps that a clever barrister could push a thumb through. She built it knowing that the man she was building it against was arguably the most respected figure in the British wizarding world, which meant that when she finally put it in front of the Wisengamot it needed to be airtight. She spent those 4 years doing the following things. First, commissioning an independent magical analysis of the 11 constructs from the Department of Mysteries, working through 3 different researchers sequentially so that no single person held the complete picture until she needed them to. Second, tracing the history of Harry's placement, every decision, every document, every communication that had led to a 4-year-old magical child being left with non-magical relatives without formal legal process, guardianship documentation, or ministry oversight. Third, finding Sirius Black's file, which had been sitting in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's archives for 7 years collecting dust, and reading every piece of it, and calling in the trial records, and discovering, with the particular cold fury she reserved for institutional failures, that there weren't any. No trial. No hearing. No formal charge sheet reviewed by a Wisengamot member. Sirius Black had been placed in Azkaban in November 1981 by a ministry official acting on Bartemius Crouch Sr.'s verbal authority, without a trial, on the basis of eyewitness statements from Aurors who had arrived at a scene where 1 man was standing and 12 muggles and 1 wizard were dead. She read this twice to make sure she hadn't missed anything. She hadn't. She put the file in a separate section of her case materials and labeled it, Black, S, Related Matter. Urgent. She did not move fast. She moved correctly. Harry turned 8 on the 31st of July, and Miriam brought him a lemon cake from a bakery in Diagon Alley and a set of books on advanced transfiguration theory that were probably inappropriate for his age and exactly appropriate for his abilities, and he sat at the kitchen table in her house. He'd been living there for nearly 4 years now, in the small bedroom with the window that looked out over the garden, and ate lemon cake with focused appreciation. 8, Miriam said, sitting across from him with tea. 8, he agreed. He had grown. He was still on the thin side of average. The malnutrition from Privet Drive had left traces that 4 years of proper feeding were still resolving, but he was quicker now, more angular, with the beginning of the height that was going to make him eventually quite tall. His glasses had been replaced twice. His hair still went in every direction. Is something happening soon? He said. What makes you ask? He looked at her over his cake. You brought a very nice cake. She kept her expression steady. You like lemon. You only bring the really nice cake when you're preparing me for something. He ate another bite. It's fine. You can tell me. I've been thinking, she said, that it's time to move forward on some things we've been preparing for. He set down his fork. He was looking at her with that attention, the full beam attention she'd gotten used to over 4 years of being his primary person in the world. The Wisengamot. Yes. Dumbledore. Yes. And Sirius Black, he said. She stopped. He watched her stop. How do you know about Sirius Black? He picked his fork back up and cut another piece of cake. I've been reading everything you've left on the kitchen table for 4 years, he said. I know you do it partly on purpose because you want me to be informed and you're not sure how to bring some of it up. And I appreciate it. He ate the piece of cake. Sirius Black was my godfather and he's in Azkaban for something the records suggest he might not have done. Miriam looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her tea. The case is ready, she said. Amelia has called the session for September. Before the school year begins. Harry processed this. The beginning of September. That's a month away. Yes. And I'll testify. You don't have to. He looked at her with the expression she thought of as his please don't be absurd expression, which he had developed sometime around age 6 and deployed with increasing frequency. Of course I'll testify. He put 11 constructs in me. I was there. You were 4. You don't remember the placing. I remember everything after. I remember the scan. I remember the removal. He met her eyes steadily. And I'm the one he did it to. It would be strange if I didn't say something. She said nothing. Miriam. He set his fork down again. I'm not afraid of him. I know you're not. Are you? He said, and it wasn't a challenge. Genuine question, asked carefully. She thought about it honestly, because she'd learned that he could always tell when she didn't. Not of him, she said. Of the room. Of people who've decided what they believe and won't be moved by evidence. He considered this. We have good evidence. We have excellent evidence. Then we'll be fine. He picked up his fork again. Can I have more cake? She sliced him another piece. Outside, the garden was caught in late July afternoon light, the old apple tree making its comfortable shade, and she thought that if Lily Potter could have seen this, could have seen her son at 8 years old, eating birthday cake in a safe kitchen and thinking clearly about legal strategy, she would have been simultaneously proud beyond measure and incandescent with rage at the circumstances that made it necessary. Both things, Miriam thought, at exactly the same time. The Wisengamot chamber was underground, beneath the ministry, and had been used for every significant legal proceeding in British wizarding history for 3 centuries. The walls were dark stone. The seats rose in tiered semicircles around a central floor, high-backed chairs for the 50 members, carved with the symbols of their offices. 3 aurors stood at the chamber's main entrance. 3 more stood at the back. Amelia Bones stood at the central floor when Harry and Miriam arrived, flanked by 2 of her senior legal staff. She looked, Harry thought, exactly like someone who had been waiting 4 years for this and had spent the time well. She wore formal Wisengamot observer robes of deep red and her monocle caught the enchanted lighting of the chamber and briefly flashed. Harry, she said. Director Bones. He'd met her 6 times over the past 4 years, always at Miriam's kitchen table, always in the context of evidence review. She was one of the few people who talked to him directly rather than around him, and he respected that. Is he here yet? He's been informed and confirmed. He'll arrive with his representative. She paused. How are you? Ready, he said, which was the accurate answer. She studied him for a moment with the professional eye of someone who had been reading people in adversarial settings for decades. Then she nodded, apparently finding what she was looking for. The session will begin in 30 minutes. You'll be called after the evidence presentation. I'll give you a signal. They sat in the observer gallery, Harry, Miriam, and Thaddeus Wren, who had come because he was a primary evidence witness and also because he'd told Miriam tersely that he wasn't going to miss it. Around them, the chamber was filling. Wisengamot members in plum-colored robes took their seats with the particular self-important rustling of people who knew they were important. Journalists from the Daily Prophet had been barred from the chamber under Amelia's direct order. This session was sealed, the results to be published after the conclusion, but Harry had learned enough about wizarding media over 4 years to know that the outcome would be in every paper within an hour of the session ending. He watched the chamber fill and thought about all the people in it who had, for years, called Albus Dumbledore a genius. A hero. The greatest wizard of the age. He thought, we'll see. Dumbledore arrived 8 minutes before the session was called to order. Harry had seen photographs. He had not, until now, seen the man himself. He was tall, taller than photographs suggested, and old, with the specific kind of oldness that gave the impression of deep time, of someone who had outlasted several versions of the world. Long silver hair, long silver beard, half-moon spectacles perched on a long crooked nose. He wore midnight blue robes with silver stars, and he moved with the unhurried ease of someone for whom rooms arranged themselves. He had, Harry noted, extraordinarily blue eyes. The kind of blue that was specifically designed to communicate wisdom and benevolence. He probably knew this. He had almost certainly practiced it. He came through the chamber's main door with a man Harry recognized from Miriam's files as Elphias Doge, elderly, devoted, not an effective legal representative but the best Dumbledore could do on 4 years' notice without alerting people to the seriousness of what was coming. Dumbledore moved to the respondent's chair at the center of the floor with the composure of a man who was not concerned. He sat. He arranged his robes. He folded his hands. And then he looked up at the observer gallery, and his gaze found Harry. The blue eyes were, up close and even at a distance, absolutely extraordinary, alert and layered, containing within them the impression of enormous accumulated intelligence. They looked at Harry the way someone looks at something they have planned for and factored in. Harry looked back. He did not look away. He thought, "You put 11 things in me and made my whole life smaller, and I walked out of that hospital 4 years ago and I've been waiting ever since, and now here we are, so let's see what you've got." Something moved in those blue eyes. Something very brief, quickly managed. But it was there. Dumbledore looked away first. The chief warlock called the session to order. He was a heavy-set man named Oglethorpe who had held the position for 12 years and was, Amelia had explained to Harry, technically neutral, practically aligned with the status quo, but honest enough that good evidence would move him. She'd said, "The evidence will move him. That's all we need." Amelia presented the case for 40 minutes. She presented it the way she did everything, without flourish, without rhetorical performance, with the devastating weight of very well-organized facts. She walked the chamber through the diagnostic findings of July 1985. She presented Miriam's full report, Thaddeus's independent verification, and the Department of Mysteries analysis, all three in agreement on the nature and origin of the 11 constructs. She walked them through the signature identification methodology and its 98.7% confidence interval. She presented the evidence of Harry's physical condition on admission. She presented the legal record, or rather, the near-total absence of one, surrounding Harry's placement with the Dursleys. And then she laid out the file on Sirius Black and explained, in the same flat and devastating tone, that a man had been in Azkaban for 7 years without a trial. The chamber was very quiet for most of this. The kind of quiet that isn't calm so much as a collective refusal to speak while things are still being absorbed. Dumbledore sat throughout in the respondent's chair with the expression of someone listening to a piece of music he has heard before and is not afraid of. When Amelia finished, Oglethorpe opened the chamber to the respondent. Doge stood and began, somewhat tremulously, to put forward the position that the evidence was circumstantial, that the signature identification methodology was inherently limited, that Dumbledore's profound contributions to the wizarding world ought to be considered contextually. He was building to an argument about the greater good. Harry could see the shape of it coming. "Director Bones," said Oglethorpe, "you have additional witnesses?" "I do," said Amelia. "The first is healer Miriam Voss, who conducted the original diagnostic." Miriam went down. She was concise, clear, and unassailable. She had done this for 23 years and the Wisengamot did not rattle her. She answered every question put to her with the accuracy of someone who kept meticulous notes and remembered why. When Doge attempted to suggest that her aura background represented a bias, she looked at him over her reading glasses with the specific expression of someone who has decided not to waste a full sentence on a poor argument and simply said, "My methodology is in the appendix. Please refer to it." Thaddeus followed. He was even briefer. He confirmed every technical finding. He answered 3 questions about Horcrux architecture and construct design with the calm expertise of someone who had personally handled 7 dark artifacts of comparable complexity and was not going to be told he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then Amelia said, "My final witness is Harry Potter." The chamber shifted. the particular shift of a room realigning itself around a new center of gravity. Harry stood. Miriam put a hand briefly on his shoulder, not restraining, not guiding. Just there. He walked down from the gallery and through the chamber gate onto the central floor and stood at the witness position, and 50 pairs of Wizengamot eyes found him. He was 8 years old and approximately the average height for 8, which was not very tall. He wore clean dark robes that Miriam had bought him specifically for this. His hair was doing its usual thing. His glasses were straight for once. He looked around the chamber once, mapping it the way he mapped every room he entered, and then he looked at Oglethorpe. "Mr. Potter," said Oglethorpe, with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood the occasion. "Thank you for being here. You understand you're under oath?" "Yes," said Harry. "Can you tell the chamber, in your own words, what you experienced?" Harry thought about the best way to begin. He'd thought about it for weeks. He'd decided on direct. "I was 4 years old when Healer Voss scanned me," he said. His voice carried in the chamber naturally, the acoustics were designed for it, and he didn't raise it, just spoke clearly. "I'd been brought to St. Mungo's by my aunt because my arm was broken. Healer Voss found the fractures and then she found 11 other things in my magical core that shouldn't have been there. She's explained in detail what each one did, so I won't repeat all of it. I'll tell you what it felt like." The chamber was very quiet. "It felt like everything was far away," he said. "Like the world was happening through a wall. I thought that was just how life was. I didn't know I was supposed to feel more than I was feeling, or remember more clearly, or trust people more easily. I didn't know those things were being prevented." He paused. "When Healer Voss and Healer Wren removed the constructs, I could remember my mother for the first time. I could feel things I couldn't feel before. I found out I was angry, which I hadn't known." He looked at the chamber steadily. "I'm telling you this not because I want you to feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what those constructs actually did, in concrete terms, to an actual person. Because the reports are very thorough and technically accurate, and I think it is easy to read technical reports about a child without thinking about what the child experienced." A member near the back of the chamber made a small sound. Harry didn't look at him. "The signature on all 11 constructs is Albus Dumbledore's," he said. "The same man who decided, without legal process, that I should be placed with Muggle relatives who, the evidence shows, were abusing me. The same man who has, as far as I can tell, been making decisions about my life since before I can remember, without asking me or informing me or obtaining any kind of legal authority to do so." He paused again. "I am 8 years old. I understand that my opinion on what should happen next is not what this chamber is here to determine. But I want to be clear, what was done to me was not an accident, and it was not a mistake, and I would like it treated accordingly." He stopped. He looked at Oglethorpe, indicating he was done. The chamber was silent for a moment. Then Dumbledore spoke. "May I address the witness?" Oglethorpe looked at Amelia. Amelia nodded once, fractionally. "Briefly," said Oglethorpe. Dumbledore stood. He was very tall in the chamber's lighting, and he looked at Harry with those blue eyes and the expression of someone who had considered this moment in advance and prepared himself for it, and he said, "Harry, I want you to know that everything I did out of love for you and for the wizarding world. The sacrifices involved were necessary, were they?" said Harry. The chamber blinked. Oglethorpe raised his hand slightly, indicating he'd allow the exchange. "Were they necessary," Harry said, "or were they convenient?" "Because they were convenient for you. You got to decide everything. No one questioned you. No one looked too closely. And I grew up not knowing what I was, not feeling what I should have felt, not remembering my own mother's face." He looked at Dumbledore without anger in his voice, just the clean precision of someone who has thought very carefully about what they want to say. "You didn't make those sacrifices. You made me make them without my knowledge or consent. Those are extremely different things. Something happened in Dumbledore's blue eyes. The layered, experienced composure shifted, and underneath it was something that was genuinely complicated, not guilt, exactly, or not guilt alone, but a kind of collision. The man who had decided, a very long time ago, that the end justified the means, meeting the end itself, which was standing in front of him at 4.5 feet tall and looking at him without flinching. "You are extraordinary," Dumbledore said, and it came out almost involuntarily, the admission of a man who had planned for many things and had not quite planned for this specific version of Harry Potter. "I know," said Harry. "You tried very hard to make sure I wasn't." He returned to the gallery. Miriam's hand found his shoulder again briefly. He sat down and watched Oglethorpe call the chamber to deliberation. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes during which the chamber murmured and Dumbledore sat with folded hands and Amelia stood very still at the center of the floor and Miriam brought Harry a glass of water and he drank it and felt the room around him with the expanded senses he'd had for 4 years now, the ones that still sometimes surprised him with their depth. He could feel Dumbledore from across the chamber. The man's magical signature was extraordinary, layered and ancient and dense, the signature of someone who had been practicing at the highest level for 70 years. He could feel all the people in the Wizengamot, their individual signatures mixing like a chord. He could feel Amelia's focus, a tight, sharp, extremely organized magical presence. He thought, for 4 years, one of those 11 constructs was making me invisible to people's magical senses. For 4 years, nobody looked too closely because they literally couldn't quite see me. He thought, I am going to be very visible from now on. Oglethorpe called the chamber back to order. He read the findings. The vote on the authenticity and implications of the diagnostic evidence had passed unanimously, not a single Wizengamot member willing to go on record as doubting the combined testimony of 3 expert witnesses and a complete Department of Mysteries analysis. The vote on formal charges had passed 43-7, which Amelia had said privately was the upper end of what she'd expected. Albus Dumbledore was formally charged with illegal use of dark magic on a minor, illegal placement of a magical child without ministry oversight, and magical interference with the development of a protected person. He was suspended from the position of Chief Warlock pending the full legal proceedings. He was not remanded to Azkaban. His representative had argued successfully for house arrest pending trial, which Amelia had allowed because it was the one point she hadn't needed to win today. He would be tried. He would be convicted. The evidence was excellent. But that was for later. For now, Oglethorpe read the secondary finding, and the chamber shifted again. In the matter of one Sirius Orion Black, Oglethorpe read, in the careful, deliberate tone he used for things he understood were significant, this chamber finds that the absence of any formal trial record constitutes a fundamental violation of the subject's legal rights. Accordingly, a formal hearing is to be convened within 14 days. Until that hearing, the subject is to be transferred from Azkaban to ministry custody pending review of the evidentiary basis for his continued detainment. He looked up at the chamber over his half-moon reading glasses. This concludes the emergency session. The chamber is adjourned. Dumbledore stood slowly. He looked, for the first time, like someone of his actual age. He gathered his robes and walked toward the exit, and as he passed the observer gallery he looked up, and Harry was already looking at him. The blue eyes held the green ones for a moment. "This isn't finished," Dumbledore said quietly. "Not a threat. An observation." "No," Harry agreed pleasantly. "It's just starting." Dumbledore moved on. The door closed behind him. Sirius Black arrived at the Ministry 3 days later, transferred from Azkaban under the supervision of 2 Aurors and a medical officer, which was standard procedure and also an inadequate description of what actually occurred. Harry had asked Miriam if he could be there. Miriam had said, "He's going to need time to." "I know," Harry said. "I'm not going to overwhelm him. I just want to be there." She'd looked at him for a moment. Then, "All right." They stood in a ministry corridor, him, Miriam, and Amelia, who had come personally to manage the transfer, when the lift arrived from the holding level and the doors opened. The man who walked out was 31 years old and looked 50. He was very thin, with the specific thinness of Azkaban, not mere weight loss but a hollowing, a deficit of substance that went deeper than physical. His dark hair was lank and long. His robes were new, ministry-issued, clean, which meant someone had thought to provide them, but they sat on him like something borrowed. His hands had a slight tremor. His eyes were gray. They were the eyes of someone who had been in the presence of Dementors for 7 years and had not quite finished being surprised that they were gone. He walked out of the lift and stopped when he saw the corridor. Something passed across his face, the simple fact of an ordinary corridor, lit normally, containing ordinary things. Amelia stepped forward. "Mr. Black. I'm Director Bones. We spoke by communication mirror. How are you feeling?" "Like a concept that's been reminded it has a body," he said. His voice was rough, slightly hoarse, the voice of someone who hadn't used it regularly in years. He looked at Miriam. "Healer Voss. Mr. Black." He looked at Harry. For a moment, he simply looked. Harry stood in the corridor and met his gaze and thought, "You lost everything the same night I did, and you've been in Azkaban for 7 years for something you didn't do, and you are James Potter's best friend and Lily Potter's loyal ally and my godfather, and no one is going to let this go on any longer." Sirius's face moved through several things at once. Recognition, James's dark hair, Lily's eyes, the combination of features he'd last seen at age 1. Something rawer than recognition, something that broke slightly at the edges. And then he laughed, which seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. Short and slightly cracked and genuine. "You look exactly like James," he said, "with Lily's eyes, and that is either the kindest or most devastating thing I've seen in 7 years, I genuinely can't tell yet." "I've been told that before," Harry said. "I think it's allowed to be both." Sirius stared at him. "How old are you?" 8. "You talk like you're 40. I've had good teachers." He paused. "Are you all right?" "Honestly." Sirius blinked. It was clearly not the question he'd been bracing for. Honest answer. "No. I don't think I've been all right for quite a long time. I think I'm probably going to need a while to." He stopped and looked at his hands, which were still doing the slight tremor thing. "I know what they found in you," he said. "They told me as part of the briefing. The constructs." He looked up. "I'm sorry. I should have, someone should have, none of that was your fault," Harry said, quite firmly. "You were in Azkaban. Before Azkaban. After, I should have, Sirius." He used the name deliberately, watching it land. "You were put there without a trial. None of this is a situation you failed to prevent. It's a situation several people created." He paused. "Dumbledore, primarily." Something moved in Sirius's gray eyes. A flash of something old and very hot. "Yes," he said carefully. "Him primarily." "Well," said Harry. "He's been charged. His trial will be in the spring. Yours will be in 2 weeks and will take approximately an hour because there is no actual evidence against you." He said it the way someone states a fact, not to comfort, just to communicate clearly. "After that, you can work out what comes next. But I wanted you to know that none of it was lost on me. That you existed and you were wronged and someone should have been angry about it a long time ago." Sirius looked at him for a long moment. The hoarseness in his expression was different now, not grief exactly, but the particular face of someone who has been waiting for a very specific thing and is startled to find it being handed to them. "James would have loved you," he said, very quietly. "I know," Harry said. Not arrogantly. Just with the certainty of someone who had read enough to understand what his father had been. "I think I would have loved him too." Amelia stepped in gently and began steering Sirius toward the medical suite, where someone was going to assess his physical condition and give him a proper meal and eventually settle him somewhere with walls that didn't have Dementors on the other side. He went with her, but turned once and looked back at Harry. Harry raised a hand. Small wave. Sirius laughed again, slightly less cracked this time. Miriam came to stand beside Harry as the corridor cleared. That went well, she said. He needs time, Harry said. Azkaban does significant psychological damage. I've been reading about it. Of course you have. She looked down at him. How are you? Actually. He thought about it. He did this with everything, actually considered it rather than reaching for the nearest convenient answer. It was strange, he said. Seeing Dumbledore. In person. He paused. He's very impressive. As a person, in a room, you understand why people trust him. Yes. It didn't change anything, he said. But I understood it. He looked at the empty corridor where Sirius had been. He called me extraordinary. He was right, for once. Harry glanced up at her. He tried very hard to prevent it. He failed, she said simply. He thought about that for a moment. The evidence session, the chamber, Dumbledore's face when he'd said, "You tried very hard to make sure I wasn't." Did you know, he said, that when they remove the constructs, in the diagnostic records, there's a sequence of when each one was placed? Thaddeus pointed it out. The oldest one was placed when I was 11 days old. Miriam said nothing. She had known this. She had not told him because she wasn't sure how he would receive it. 11 days, he said. I was 11 days old and he had already decided what I was going to be. He was quiet for a moment. That's a very long plan. It is. I've been thinking about why. Not the surface why, the war, Voldemort, the prophecy. I've been thinking about what he actually needed from me. He looked at the corridor wall, thinking through something she could see was already mostly formed. He needed me to be willing to die, he said. Specifically. That's what the constructs were building toward. A person who would walk into death for a cause without questioning whether there was another option. That's the person he was making. Miriam breathed in slowly. What he made instead, Harry said, was someone who read everything he could find about every aspect of this situation for 4 years and is fairly certain there is another option. He paused. Several, actually. Is that so? She said. Voldemort is not dead, he said, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone stating a well-researched position. I've been reading everything available on the subject, which is not much because most of it is classified, but between the restricted section material Amelia copied for me and the theoretical work on Horcrux architecture that Thaddeus explained, he's bound to something. He's fractured and diminished and probably in a fairly wretched state, but he's not gone. He looked up at her. I think we need to think about what we actually do about that. You're 8 years old. I'm aware. I also have significantly more motivation to solve this problem than most people, and a rather unique insight into certain aspects of it, and approximately 3 to 7 years before Voldemort becomes someone's active problem again. He raised an eyebrow. That seems like enough time to prepare properly. She stared at him. She had spent 4 years watching this child grow and she was still occasionally stopped flat by him. We should tell Amelia, she said finally. I was going to suggest that, he agreed. And Sirius, once he's had time to recover. He was close to the original order. He'll have information that isn't in any file. He paused, and something softened fractionally in his expression. I liked him. He laughed. He did. He'll be all right, Harry said. Not wishfully. As a genuine assessment. He's like you. He's tough underneath. Miriam looked at him. At his dark hair and green eyes and the straight, clear certainty of his 8-year-old face. She thought about a morning 4 years ago, in an examination room that smelled of peppermint and something older, when a small child had looked at the golden diagnostic light and not been afraid of what it found. She thought about everything he had become in 4 years without 11 chains and with proper food and a house and books and someone who looked him in the eye and told him the truth. She thought, Dumbledore planned for decades and he still couldn't account for this. He couldn't account for what Harry would actually be, given half a chance, because he never intended to give him the chance. She thought, his greatest mistake was not placing the constructs. His greatest mistake was that the one he placed them in turned out, even under 11 layers of suppression, to be exactly this. "Let's go home," she said. "I'll make dinner." He fell into step beside her. He was quiet for a moment, the way he went quiet when he was working through something. "Miriam," he said. Thank you. For not looking away." She thought about a waiting room, a small boy with a broken arm and ancient eyes, and a piece of heavy parchment she'd addressed to Amelia Bones with hands she hadn't let shake. "That's my job," she said. He glanced up at her. "It was more than your job." She didn't say anything to that. But she slowed her pace very slightly so that they were walking side by side rather than her slightly ahead, which was the same thing as an acknowledgement, for people who communicated the way they did. They walked out of the ministry together into a September afternoon in London, the kind of afternoon that was still warm but carried in it the first suggestion of the autumn to come, and Harry tilted his head back briefly and looked up at the sky. He did this sometimes, had been doing it since he was 4, since the first morning after the constructs were gone when he'd watched London turn from dark to grey to gold. She'd asked him once what he was looking at. "Everything," he'd said. Today the sky was wide and blue and full of the particular light of early autumn, and he looked at it for 3 seconds and then looked forward and kept walking, and she thought that was exactly right. The world was very large. He was not afraid of it. He never had been, really. Dumbledore had tried to make him small enough to be manageable, and 4 years later Harry Potter was 8 years old and already seeing 3 moves ahead and choosing, of his own completely free will, to fight. Not because anyone had built him to. Not because he had no other option. Because he'd thought it through and decided it was the right thing to do. Which, she reflected, walking beside him through the September afternoon, was rather the point. Chapter 4, The Boy Himself. 3 years later, an owl arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning in late July, which was notable because Harry had turned 11 4 days earlier, and the owl arrived not with the standard Hogwarts envelope that Miriam had been quietly expecting but with 2 letters, the standard one with the Hogwarts seal, and beneath it, a second on heavier parchment with a different seal entirely and a handwriting he didn't recognize. He was in the garden when it landed on the fence post beside him, because he'd taken to doing his reading outside in summer, sprawled in the grass under the apple tree with whatever he was currently working through. Today it was an advanced text on magical theory that Sirius had sent him last Christmas with a note that said, "Thought this might keep you busy for 5 minutes. It had kept him busy for 4 months, which he thought Sirius had probably anticipated. He took both letters from the owl, fed it a biscuit from the plate Miriam kept on the kitchen windowsill specifically for that purpose. She'd given up pretending this was unusual, and opened the standard Hogwarts letter first. Standard. Completely standard. Supply list, term dates, the usual. He turned to the second letter. "Dear Mr. Potter, my name is Minerva McGonagall. I was recently appointed headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry following the suspension of the previous holder of that position pending legal proceedings, of which I understand you are already aware. I wanted to write to you personally for 2 reasons. The first is to say that I am aware of your history, the circumstances of your early life, and the events of 4 years ago, and I want you to know that Hogwarts, under my administration, will be a place where you are treated as a student and a person rather than as a symbol or an obligation. The second is to say that I taught your parents. Your father was one of the finest Transfiguration students I ever had, which I will deny saying if asked. Your mother was the finest charm worker of her generation and one of the most formidable minds I have encountered in 40 years of teaching. I expect great things from you. I also expect that you will be a great deal of work. I find these 2 expectations frequently coincide. I look forward to meeting you in September. Minerva McGonagall, Headmistress, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Harry read it twice. Then he went inside. Miriam was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a stack of case review documents. She'd taken on a part-time consultancy for the DMLE over the past 2 years, which had grown into something rather larger than part-time. She looked up when he came in. He put both letters on the table in front of her and sat down and poured himself tea from the pot. She read them. She read the McGonagall letter twice, the same way he had. "Well," she said. "She sounds like you," he said. "She sounds like herself, which is considerably more alarming." She set the letters down. "How do you feel?" He thought about it. He'd been thinking about Hogwarts in the abstract for years, had read everything available, had covered most of the 1st through 4th year curriculum through private study with Miriam and the rotating cast of tutors she'd brought in, and had spent 3 years in weekly sessions with Sirius that had covered everything from advanced defensive magic to the particular art of getting out of situations that most people wouldn't have gotten into in the first place. "Ready," he said. And then, because he was being honest, and curious. "I want to see it." "The castle?" "Everything. The other students. What it's actually like." He picked up his tea. "I've read about it for 3 years. I want to see if it matches." Miriam looked at him in the way she sometimes did, the particular look he associated with her processing something she found simultaneously predictable and remarkable about him. "It won't," she said. "It never does. That's the point." He considered this. "Good," he said. Sirius came for dinner that evening, which was not unusual. He'd been coming for dinner at least twice a week for 2 years, ever since his trial had been concluded with the swift and decisive result Harry had predicted. The formal exoneration entered into the record and the public announcement of his innocence generating the kind of press coverage that had made Sirius simultaneously vindicated and deeply irritable for about 6 weeks. He'd moved into a flat in London, was working on restoring his health in the specific way that was taking longer than any of them had expected because 7 years of Azkaban was not something the body let go of quickly, and had established himself as something in Harry's life that didn't have a clean category but was the closest thing to an older, chaotic, occasionally irresponsible, deeply loyal uncle that Harry had encountered. He arrived with a bottle of good wine for Miriam and a package for Harry that turned out to be a miniaturized set of professional Quidditch equipment, sized down with a charm he'd done himself. "You'll want to make the team," Sirius said, dropping into a chair. "First years don't usually, but you're not usually a first year." "I've been practicing," Harry said. "I know. I've been watching from the street and pretending I haven't." He opened his wine without waiting to be asked, which was typical. "McGonagall wrote to you. You knew about that?" "She wrote to me first, to ask what you were like." He poured his wine. "I told her you were the most alarmingly competent person I'd ever met, which is both a compliment and a warning, and she said that tracked with what she'd been told, and that she was looking forward to it in the way one looks forward to a controlled explosion." Harry processed this. "I'm not a controlled explosion." "You absolutely are," said Miriam from the kitchen, without looking up. "You're the most focused, intentional controlled explosion I've ever seen," Sirius said agreeably. "It's actually quite impressive. Your dad was more of a scattered explosion. Your mum was precision detonation. You're something in between, with your own particular flavor." He looked at Harry over his wine. "You nervous?" "No. Not even a little." "Maybe a little," Harry said. "About the social parts. I haven't been around a lot of people my age." This was true and had been one of Miriam's ongoing considerations. Harry's private tutoring had given him an exceptional education and done nothing for the normal social development of an 11-year-old. She'd arranged things when she could, occasional sessions with other children at the Magical Education Center in Diagon Alley, a summer program the previous year, Sirius's various informal connections. But he was going to arrive at Hogwarts with a more significant gap between his academic ability and his experience of being around peers than most students. "You'll be fine," Sirius said. "You don't know that. I know you. You're curious about people. That goes a long way." He swirled his wine. "The ones who are nervous around you, you'll figure out. The ones who are idiots, you'll handle. The ones who are worth knowing, he paused. There'll be more of those than you expect. Harry thought about this. What if the Sorting Hat puts me somewhere I don't want to be? Sirius grinned, which transformed his still too thin face into something that was clearly the ghost of devastating pre-Azkaban charm. What if it asks you where you want to go? Does it do that? It did for me. I was the first black in living memory not sorted into Slytherin, and I think the hat was sufficiently startled to want my input. He looked at Harry thoughtfully. Where do you want to go? Harry had thought about this. He'd been thinking about it for years, actually, the way he thought about most things, from multiple angles, with reference to available evidence, until he arrived at an answer that felt genuinely his. Ravenclaw, he said. Sirius blinked. Not Gryffindor. Gryffindor is for people who are brave in the sense of running toward things without stopping to think first, Harry said. I run toward things. I just think first. Sirius stared at him for a moment. I cannot decide if James would be proud or devastated. Both, said Harry, which made Sirius laugh the full laugh, the good one, the one that was getting longer and less cracked with each passing month. Miriam came in from the kitchen with dinner, and they ate together at the table that had been the center of Harry's life for 7 years, under the warm light, and the conversation moved easily through the trial updates. Dumbledore's full proceedings were expected to conclude in December, and Quidditch strategy and Miriam's DMLE consultancy work, and Harry watched Sirius and Miriam argue cheerfully about something he'd stopped tracking 20 minutes ago, and felt the specific comfort of a life that had been chosen rather than assigned. Platform 9 3/4 was, like most things he'd read about, both exactly what he expected and completely different to imagine than to stand in the middle of. He'd known about the steam, the scarlet engine, the noise. He hadn't known how it would feel to be in the crowd, the specific density and texture of 100 magical families saying goodbye at once, the overlapping magical signatures, the smell of pastries from the trolley already loaded onto the train. He and Miriam stood at the platform barrier after pushing through, and she was doing the thing she always did when she was trying to appear unconcerned, which was being extremely focused on whether his trunk was loaded correctly. It's loaded fine, he said. The potions kit needs to be, Miriam. She stopped. She looked at him. He was the same height as her now, had hit a growth surge in the spring that showed no sign of stopping, which she had announced was inconvenient and he had pointed out was not something either of them had control over. I'll be all right, he said. I know you will, she said. That's not the part I'm concerned about. What are you concerned about? She looked at him for a moment, 11 years old, green-eyed, dark-haired, with the self-possession of someone considerably older and the beginning of the person he was going to be visible in the way he stood. Absolutely nothing, she said. I'm being sentimental. Ignore it. He did not hug her because they were not large huggers, the two of them, and they both knew it. But he put a hand briefly on her arm and she put her hand over it briefly, and that was their version of it, and it was entirely sufficient. All right, he said. Every week. Every week, he agreed. He walked toward the train. He found a compartment near the middle of the train that was empty and loaded his carry bag onto the overhead rack and sat down and looked out the window at the platform. He had approximately 4 minutes before people started filling up the train, which was 4 minutes to simply be here. He used them. He watched the platform through the window, families and owls and trunks and the specific controlled chaos of the start of a school year, and thought, this is the beginning of something. Not the beginning of his life, that had begun properly in a hospital examination room at age 4, and most significantly it had begun in the moment Miriam had said I found a few things I want to take a closer look at and decided not to look away. But this was the beginning of the next part. The part where he stopped learning in a kitchen and a library in Sirius's chaotic flat and started doing it in the world. He was ready. The compartment door opened. A girl came in, slightly out of breath, with a bushy cloud of brown hair and a book under each arm and a small overnight bag that she was managing with slightly more ambition than dexterity. She stopped when she saw him. Oh, sorry, is this, she looked at the empty seats. Is anyone else, just me, he said. Sit wherever. She sat across from him, arranged her bags with a focused efficiency that suggested she had opinions about organization, and immediately opened one of the books. Then she looked up, apparently deciding something about social protocol. Hermione Granger, she said. First year. Muggle-born. You. Harry Potter, he said. First year. She stared at him. He watched the recognition move across her face. She was clearly someone who had done her reading, which he respected immediately. The Harry Potter? I'm the only one I know of. She visibly decided something about how she was going to handle this, which he could see her doing in real time, processing, categorizing, adjusting. I've read about you, she said. About what happened? 4 years ago, and what, Dumbledore? She paused. I think what you did at the Wizengamot was extraordinary. At 8 years old. I had excellent preparation, he said. And good evidence. You took it apart methodically, she said, with the enthusiasm of someone who had clearly read the transcript. The bit about the difference between making sacrifices yourself versus imposing them on someone else, I thought about that for days. He looked at her with genuine interest. What did you conclude? She blinked, apparently not having expected a question back. Then she settled forward slightly, which was the body language of someone who had an actual opinion and was delighted to be asked for it. That the philosophical tradition of the greater good has consistently been used to justify decisions made by the powerful on behalf of the powerless, and that if you actually applied the principle rigorously it would almost always require the people advocating for it to bear the cost themselves, rather than outsourcing the sacrifice, he said. Exactly, she said. And then seemed to hear that she'd been talking with the energy of someone who didn't always get the opportunity to do so. Sorry. I tend to, don't apologize, he said. That was interesting. Have you read Ballantyne on utilitarian ethics in magical governance? Because your point tracks with his 3rd chapter almost exactly. She stared. You've read Ballantyne? Have you? I found it in Flourish and Blots. My parents thought it was extremely odd that I wanted it. She said my parents with the easy warmth of someone who had good ones, and he noticed it the way he noticed things, cataloging it and moving on. How did you? I've had a lot of time for reading, he said. And a guardian who has very good opinions about what's worth reading. By the time the train pulled out of the station, they had established a mutual interest in magical theory, a shared view on the application of logic to defense against the dark arts that turned out to align closely despite being independently arrived at, and a provisional but genuine friendship based on the very simple fact that they were both people who thought carefully about things and had found someone else who did the same. The compartment door opened again, roughly 40 minutes into the journey. A red-haired boy with freckles and something on his nose that was either ink or food looked in and said, "Can I? Everywhere else is full, sit down," Harry said pleasantly. He sat. He was, Harry determined within about 6 minutes, generous and funny and extremely comfortable in his own chaos in the specific way of someone from a large family where individual identity had been carved out through personality rather than circumstance. His name was Ron Weasley. He had 5 brothers and a sister. He offered Harry a pasty from his lunch pack and looked genuinely delighted when Harry took it, which suggested he was either generous by nature or had been briefed that sharing food was polite, and Harry suspected it was both. "You're Harry Potter," Ron said, about halfway through the pasty. "He knows," said Hermione. "Right, obviously, sorry," Ron looked slightly embarrassed and then rallied. "My mum told me about what happened. The Wizengamot thing." She cried. Which for my mum is, she doesn't cry easily. She was just very angry on your behalf. She's like that about kids being, you know. He gestured vaguely at the general concept of Harry's early life. Harry thought he liked Ron's mother already. "What house do you think you'll be in?" Ron asked. "Ravenclaw," Harry said. Ron looked mildly surprised. "Not Gryffindor." "My whole family's been Gryffindor, I'm sort of hoping you'll probably be Gryffindor, Harry said. You're brave in the right way for it. Ron looked at him. What's the right way? You don't overthink danger, Harry said. You just respond to it. Ron appeared to be parsing whether this was a compliment. He decided it was. Ravenclaw's brilliant, though, he said loyally. My brother Percy was nearly Ravenclaw. Dad says some of the greatest. I know, Harry said. That's why I chose it. The three of them arrived at Hogwarts in a boat with a fourth student, a nervous, round-faced boy named Neville who was clutching a toad and appeared to be steeling himself for something, and Harry watched the castle appear out of the darkness of the lake and felt, for the first time, the wards. It was the first time he'd been near anything with wards of this age and complexity, and they hit him like walking into warm water, enormous, layered, ancient, the accumulated magic of 1,000 years pressing gently against his senses from every direction at once. He could feel where the wards were strong and where they had been repaired over centuries, could feel the specific pulse of them that was distinct from any other magical structure he'd encountered. He kept his expression still. But he thought, so that's what 1,000 years of magic feels like. The Great Hall was everything the books said and nothing like reading about it. The enchanted ceiling. The 4 long tables. The hundreds of candles and the hundreds of students and the specific noise of a very large group of people who were mostly performing casualness while being distinctly not casual. The Sorting Hat sat on its stool. It turned out Harry knew several things about the Sorting Hat that most first years didn't, because Sirius had explained the process and Miriam had found a historical account of how it worked, and so when it was placed on his head and he felt the brush of an ancient magical intelligence against his own mind, he was not startled. Well, said the hat, in the particular way of something that communicated directly rather than through sound. Now this is interesting. I've been looking forward to this, Harry thought back. Have you? Not a question. The hat seemed to be doing something equivalent to taking stock. You've prepared for this. You know what you want. Ravenclaw, he said. I can see that. I can also see, the hat paused, which he hadn't expected. There's a great deal of you here. More than most. You've had things removed, I think. Yes. And this is what was left. Another pause. Or rather, this is what was always there. Yes. The hat seemed to be communicating something like appreciation for this, in the way that very old and intelligent things appreciated precision. You could go anywhere, it said. You know that. I know, Harry said. I want Ravenclaw. Because you think first. Because I want to spend 7 years learning everything I can, he said honestly, and then I want to know what I do with it. Ravenclaw. The hat announced, and the Ravenclaw table erupted into applause, and Harry crossed the hall and sat down with a feeling he couldn't quite name except that it was precisely where he'd decided to be and that felt exactly right. He looked up at the enchanted ceiling and thought, this is going to be very good. The first week of Hogwarts was, in order of memorability, classes, the library, a conversation that would define the year, and Draco Malfoy. The classes were excellent. Every single one of them, even History of Magic, which was taught by a ghost who delivered information in a soporific monotone, but the information itself was interesting if you didn't wait for the ghost to make it interesting. He took notes on things the ghost said that didn't match what he'd read and followed up in the library, which led to the discovery of a fascinating discrepancy in the historical account of the 1612 Goblin Rebellion that he spent 3 evenings thinking about. Charms was extraordinary. Professor Flitwick, small, enthusiastic, with the bouncy energy of someone who had spent 50 years in love with his subject and intended to spend 50 more, demonstrated the basic wand movement for Wingardium Leviosa on the second day, and Harry had it on his first attempt, clean and precise, which made Flitwick make a small delighted sound and then recover himself and move on to assist other students. Harry moved his feather in small controlled circles for the rest of the class and thought about the theoretical implications of how the weight of the object affected the required magical energy and made 3 pages of notes. Transfiguration was taught by a deputy head whose name he had learned was Professor Sprout, filling in while McGonagall handled headmistress duties, and she was warm and excellent and patient. Harry liked her immediately. The library was everything. He went every evening that week and spent at least 2 hours, which made him something of an outlier among first years but not as much of one as he'd expected. Hermione was already there when he arrived on the first night, which he'd anticipated, and on the third night he found a fourth-year Ravenclaw named Penelope Clearwater who gave him a look of senior to junior acknowledgement that he found more warming than he probably would have expected. The conversation happened in a common room on Wednesday evening. A second-year named Anthony Goldstein had heard somehow about the Wisengamot session. Children of ministry families talked, and asked Harry, with the directness of someone who had decided he was just going to ask rather than wonder, what it had actually been like. Harry told him, condensed and straightforward, and watched Goldstein and the 3 others who had drifted over during the telling listen with the focused attention of people receiving new information rather than confirming existing stories. When he finished, Goldstein said, "And you're going to do something about Voldemort?" "Yes," Harry said. "Are you worried about it?" "No," he said, which was true. He was not worried about it in the way that implied anxiety. He was thinking about it in the way that implied strategy. "What are you going to do?" "Learn everything I can first. Then decide." He looked at Goldstein. "Why? Are you asking because you want to help?" Goldstein blinked, apparently having not gotten that far in his thinking. He considered it for a moment, the way people considered things when they were taking the question seriously rather than performing consideration. "Yes," he said. "Actually, I think I might." That was the conversation. Draco Malfoy happened on Friday. Harry had encountered him briefly at the robe fittings in Diagon Alley in August and formed the assessment: intelligent, arrogant in the specific way that comes from insecurity looking for scaffolding, and interesting in the way that most people were interesting if you paid attention. He'd filed the assessment and moved on. At Hogwarts, Malfoy had clearly been doing his own assessment of Harry and had arrived at some conclusions that were informed primarily by the assumption that his own position in the social hierarchy was fixed and Harry's relative to it was knowable. He appeared in the corridor outside the Transfiguration classroom on Friday morning with his 2 constants, Crabbe and Goyle, large and imprecise, and fell into step beside Harry with the ease of someone who had practiced seeming casual. "Potter," he said. "I've been meaning to introduce myself properly. Draco Malfoy." "I know who you are," Harry said. Malfoy seemed to have expected this to land differently, to produce either deference or resistance. Harry's flat acknowledgement appeared to require recalculation. "My father," he began, "has significant connections in the ministry. He was very interested to hear you'd be starting this year." "I imagine a lot of people were," Harry said. "He thinks you and I could be useful to each other," Malfoy said. He had a practiced quality to this speech, the delivery of something rehearsed. The right connections at Hogwarts can make all the difference. "There are people here you shouldn't waste time with, Weasleys, for instance. Ron Weasley is my friend," Harry said, without heat. Malfoy's delivery stumbled. "The Weasleys are, a family with a long magical history, considerable personal integrity, and in Ron's case a genuine gift for strategic thinking." He looked at Malfoy directly. "I don't make friends based on who their family is. I make them based on who they actually are." He paused, and his tone stayed entirely even and unhostile. "So far you've referenced your father twice in 60 seconds and told me who not to spend time with. That's not a good start." Malfoy stared at him. His expression had moved through several things rapidly, the social confidence collapsing inward to reveal something younger and less managed underneath. "That said," Harry continued, "I don't have any particular interest in being your enemy. You're clearly smart enough to be interesting when you're not performing. If you want to talk properly sometime, not your father's version, yours, I'm around." He pushed open the classroom door and went in. Hermione, who had been half a step behind him throughout this exchange and had heard all of it, came in after him and sat down and said, quietly and with controlled admiration, "That was extremely well done." "He'll be angry for a bit," Harry said. "And then?" He thought about it. "And then he'll think about it. He's smart." He'll realize the script he was using isn't working. And then we'll see what he does with that. He opened his notebook. People are more interesting when they're not following someone else's plan. Hermione looked at him for a moment. You think about people the same way you think about problems. People are the most interesting problem there is, he said. She seemed to decide this was both true and characteristic of him, and turned to her own notes. He was walking back from the library on Sunday evening of the first week, later than he'd intended. The discrepancy in the Goblin Rebellion records had led him to 6 other texts and he'd lost track of time, when he felt it. The castle's wards. He'd been feeling them all week, familiar now, like a background hum. But something in them had shifted, a particular quality in the third-floor corridor, a thickening, a concentration of something that was both part of the wards and somehow separate from them. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and paid attention. There was something behind the locked door on the 3rd floor. He'd known this in theory. Hermione had found out from Hagrid within the first 3 days that the corridor was forbidden, which had made her immediately want to know why, which was a response he found entirely sensible. The wards around it were significantly more concentrated than anywhere else in the castle, and underneath them was the distinct signature of a specific magical object of significant power. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and thought about this. The signature was old and complex and familiar in a strange way, not familiar like something he'd encountered before, but familiar like something he'd read about extensively. The Philosopher's Stone. Nicholas Flamel. The logic of it was simple once you followed the chain, the most powerful alchemical object in existence, Flamel too old to guard it himself, Dumbledore's trusted connection to Flamel, except Dumbledore was under house arrest in connection with his own trial and presumably had either made arrangements before that or someone else had taken over the arrangements. He filed it and continued to his dormitory. He had 6 years to worry about the Philosopher's Stone. He had approximately 1 week to figure out the social architecture of Hogwarts, 3 essays due before the following Friday, and a letter to Miriam to write. He wrote the letter first, which was partly about the week and partly about his observations regarding the castle's magical structure, and added a postscript. The wards on the 3rd floor corridor are interesting. I'll tell you more when I understand more. Then he did the essays, which took him 2.5 hours and were better than they needed to be because he couldn't stop himself. Then he lay in bed in the blue-curtained quiet of the Ravenclaw dormitory and listened to the other boys in his year sleeping, 4 of them, pleasant enough, all of them more ordinary in their first week nerves than he was, and thought about the castle around him. He could feel it, faintly, from here. The weight of it. The wards moving above and below and around, the old magic threaded through the stones like roots through soil. The castle was alive in the way that places where enormous amounts of magic had been done for a very long time were alive, accumulating it like sediment, and it pressed against his senses gently and continuously. He thought, I like it here. It was a simple thought. It didn't require elaboration. He simply, genuinely, for the first time, liked where he was and who he was around and what he was doing. He turned it over once, acknowledging it. Then he went to sleep. He slept easily, which he'd been able to do for 7 years now, but it still felt like something worth noticing. Outside the castle, the grounds were dark and the lake was still and the forbidden forest stood at the edge of everything, enormous and old and full of its own kinds of magic. The wards of the castle swept over all of it, the steady pulse of 1,000 years, and somewhere in their pattern the thing that Harry would need to deal with was already beginning to move. But not tonight. Tonight there were 4 boys sleeping in a dormitory and an 11-year-old with green eyes and no more chains who had decided, precisely, intentionally, and entirely of his own free will, what he was here for. And he had decided it the way he decided everything, by thinking it through completely, from every angle, until the answer was clear. The answer was, everything. Learn everything. See everything. Choose what to do with it. And what he would do with it, what he'd been thinking about since he was 8 years old in a corridor outside a ministry lift, watching Sirius Black rediscover that he had a body, was clear enough. He would end the war that had taken his parents. He would do it on his terms, in his way, with people he'd chosen. Not because it had been built into him. Not because someone had laid 11 constructs in his core designed to guide him to a specific ending. Because he'd thought about it and decided it was right. And nobody, ever again, was going to take the decision from him. In the morning, he would have charms first thing. Professor Flitwick was going to introduce color change charms, which Harry had already read the theory for and was looking forward to pushing at the edges of, and Hermione had mentioned she'd found a secondary text on the underlying principles which she'd leave for him in the common room. One thing at a time. He was 11 years old and exactly himself, for the first time and entirely, and the castle breathed around him and kept its old watch, and Harry Potter slept. Chapter 5. The encounter. November arrived at Hogwarts the way it always did, abruptly, without apology, replacing the last of October's sharp gold with a grey that settled into the stones of the castle and stayed there. The lake went dark. The grounds went wet. The forbidden forest disappeared into low cloud on mornings when the mist came in from the north, and the corridors were full of the specific smell of damp wool and ink and the particular combination of anxiety and enthusiasm that defined the weeks before first-term assessments. Harry didn't mind the cold. He'd spent enough of his early life in a cupboard under the stairs where cold was a given to have made his peace with it, and there was something he found almost agreeable about Hogwarts in November. The castle felt more itself, somehow, more clearly what it actually was rather than what it looked like in better weather. Exposed stone and firelight and the hum of old magic in the walls. He was walking back from an early morning session with Flitwick. The professor had started keeping him after class to work through more complex charm theory, which Harry suspected was Flitwick's version of trying to keep him adequately stimulated and which was extremely welcome, when he felt the change in the third-floor corridor. He'd been monitoring it since the first week. Not obsessively, he had 9 subjects, 3 friends in ongoing development, a letter to Miriam every Sunday, and a project with Anthony Goldstein that had grown into something with 4 other students and a once-weekly meeting in an unused classroom on Wednesday evenings. But the third-floor corridor's magical signature had become familiar enough that when it shifted he noticed the way you notice when a sound you've stopped consciously hearing suddenly stops. He stopped at the corridor junction and paid attention. The signature was the same as always in its basic structure, the concentrated wards, the deep pulse of something old and enormously powerful underneath. But there was a layer over it now that hadn't been there before. Another signature. Recent. Moving. Someone was on the 3rd floor, inside the warded section. He stood at the junction for approximately 3 seconds. Then he went up. The staircase was empty and the corridor was dim in the way of corridors that didn't get much foot traffic, the torches at lower intervals, the shadows deeper. He moved quietly and paid attention to what his senses were telling him, which was, the signature ahead was not a student, was not a teacher he recognized, and was agitated in a way that read as urgency rather than purpose. The door at the end of the corridor had a lock that was, objectively, excellent work. He recognized 3 separate warding spells on it and a 4th he hadn't encountered before that he took a moment to appreciate before he identified the structure and moved through it with a combination of Alohomora and a subtle ward dissolution that Miriam had taught him 2 summers ago. The door opened. Inside was the room with the dog. The dog was enormous, 3 heads, each one the size of a small car, sleeping fitfully with the specific bone-deep sleep of an animal under an enchantment. Harry looked at it for a long enough moment to appreciate it properly and then looked at what was underneath its enormous 3-pod position on the floor. A trapdoor. He looked at the trapdoor. He looked at the dog. He thought about what was beneath the trapdoor, what Hermione had established from the library and Ron had contributed from his brother's less-than-careful gossip and Harry had synthesized into a clear picture of what Nicholas Flamel's most valuable and dangerous possession was doing under a 3-headed dog in a school full of children. He also thought about the other signature he'd felt from the corridor, which was not here now and which had been heading downward. He went back to the corridor and stood for a moment. The signature was below him. Underground. Moving through whatever lay beneath the trapdoor, what he'd mapped, from available information, as a series of protective enchantments contributed by the school's teachers. Moving through them with difficulty, which meant either that the person didn't have the means to navigate them cleanly or that the means were working as intended against whatever this person actually was. He thought, Quirrell. He'd been watching Quirrell for 2 months with the specific attention he brought to things that didn't quite fit. The defense against the dark arts teacher was nervous in the wrong way for someone merely socially anxious, the kind of nervousness that had directionality, that was managing something rather than experiencing something. His magical signature was doubled in a way that didn't make immediate sense. He flinched when people approached him from behind and wore the turban with a grim consistency that suggested function rather than fashion. He'd brought this to Miriam in his 4th weekly letter and she'd replied, "Be careful. Don't go near him alone. Write to Amelia." He'd written to Amelia, who had replied, "I've passed this to the Auror office. They're monitoring the situation. Do nothing." He stood in the corridor and thought, someone is going through the protections toward the stone right now, which means by the time the Auror office is monitoring the situation with respond to this, the stone will be gone, which means this is one of those situations where do nothing is not actually an option. He went back to the door. He looked at the dog. He thought about the harp in the corner, which was clearly there for a reason, and cast a soft, self-sustaining musica charm on it, something Flitwick had taught him 2 weeks ago as an example of continuous effect charms, and the harp began to play and the dog's fitful sleeping deepened and its 3 heads dropped one by one with the slow inevitability of very large things surrendering to something they couldn't fight. He moved past it carefully and opened the trapdoor and dropped. Devil's Snare, he recognized the texture of it immediately and went still, the way Miriam had told him you dealt with plant-based traps, thinking warm light and dry air and lumos solum in a broad spread that made the plant recoil with a very offended rustling. He dropped the remaining distance and landed clean. Winged keys. He stood in a long chamber full of them and looked for the old-fashioned keyhole in the door ahead and then looked up at the swirling, darting mass above him and thought, the one that fits an old lock is going to look old and probably moves differently from the others, favoring one wing because it's been used. He found it in about 40 seconds, cast a simple tracking charm and then a catching spell, took it from the air without drama, and opened the door. Chess pieces the size of warhorses. He walked to the edge of the board and looked at it for a moment, and the game was already in partial progress. Quirrell had come through here, and the pieces on the opponent's side had clearly been reset partially after the first crossing. He studied the board. It was a specific configuration that he'd seen before, in a book on chess theory that Sirius had left at the house 2 Christmases ago because Sirius left books everywhere, and the solution was not elegant but it was quick. 6 moves. He made them and walked across and went through the next door. Troll, unconscious. Already dealt with. He stepped around it. The potions room had a logical puzzle that was, he thought, Professor Snape's contribution. The smallest bottle held the forward passage and another held the return, and the rest were poison or nettle wine, and there was a poem explaining the logic. He solved it in under 2 minutes because Snape had apparently decided that the correct level of difficulty for this puzzle was 5th-year logical thinking, which was reasonable as a deterrent against students and inadequate as a deterrent against an adult dark wizard who had spent years studying these specific varieties of problem. He took the bottle forward, drank it, it tasted of smoke and cold iron, and went through. The final chamber was lit by flames and had a mirror in it. The mirror of Eriste. He recognized it from Dumbledore's notes that Amelia had copied into his case file years ago, the mirror that showed the most desperate desire of the observer's heart, used in Dumbledore's original protection scheme. He stood in the entrance to the chamber and looked at it from a distance and thought, should not look into that directly. He looked around the rest of the chamber instead. Quirrell was standing in front of the mirror. He was talking to himself, or not to himself, Harry realized, because the voice answering him was not his voice, was coming from the wrong direction for his mouth, was coming from the back of his head where his turban wrapped in its careful layers. "I can see it," Quirrell said, frustration clipping the edges of the words. "I can see it in the mirror but I cannot, you are too full of your own wanting," said the other voice, and this was a voice that made the room's temperature drop 2 degrees simply by existing in it. "Step back. Let me, I don't know how to see without wanting it." "Then you are useless," said the voice, and it was not said with heat. Cold contempt, which was worse. Harry stepped into the chamber. Quirrell spun. His face, pale, sweating, with the red-rimmed eyes of someone under enormous sustained stress, did the thing that faces do when they encounter something entirely outside their prepared responses. He'd clearly expected, if anyone came through, an aura or a teacher or some institutional resistance he had a counter for. He had not expected a child of 11. Harry looked at Quirrell, and then past him at the mirror, and then at the space behind Quirrell's turban where the second presence was, less visible physically, but now that he was in the room he could feel it with the full sensitivity of a magical core that had spent 4 years developing without suppression, and what he felt was something that was wrong in a specific, architectural way. Fractured. Diminished. Enormous in potential, tiny in actual presence, like the ghost of a fire that had almost burned out. "Mr. Potter," said Quirrell, and was clearly trying to decide what to do with him. "Professor Quirrell," Harry said. He walked forward at an even pace, not rushing, stopping about 8 feet from the mirror. "I'll be honest with you, I've been watching you since September. The doubled magical signature. The way you flinch from direct contact. The turban." He looked at Quirrell with something that was genuinely close to sympathy. "This wasn't your plan originally, was it? You were a researcher. You found something in Albania that you weren't strong enough to contain, and now you're here and there's not much of you left in the decision-making." Quirrell's face worked through several things. The contempt from behind the turban was almost tactile. "Don't speak to him," said the voice. "Step aside." "You don't need the stone," Harry said. Not to Quirrell. Past him. To the presence. "Or, you need it, but not the way you think you do. You're a Horcrux problem. You divided your soul too many times and you're too fractured to reconstitute properly, and the stone's immortality won't fix the fracturing, it will just sustain a fractured state longer." Silence. Quirrell went very still. "That's not something you've been told," said the voice, slowly, and now it had a different quality, assessing rather than contemptuous. "That's something you worked out." "I've had access to good research materials," Harry said. "And a lot of time to think about this particular problem. You have been thinking about me." Again that quality of reassessment. "How interesting. The boy who defeated me thinks about me. You weren't defeated. You were deflected. There's a difference." He looked at Quirrell, who was standing in the peculiar paralysis of someone who has lost control of their own situation and hasn't yet identified a new position to take. "You won't get the stone from the mirror. It was designed specifically so that only someone who wanted to find it but not use it could retrieve it. Dumbledore's logic, actually quite good, as individual pieces of his work often were." He paused. "It's the scale of his plans where he ran into trouble." The presence was quiet for a moment. The flames in the chamber flickered. "Why are you here?" said the voice. "To make sure you don't get the stone. Yet you're talking to me rather than acting." "I'm assessing the situation. And I'm curious." He kept his voice even and genuine, because he was, in fact, genuinely curious. This was one of the most extraordinary and terrible things he would likely ever encounter, and curiosity was the appropriate response to extraordinary things. "You built 7 Horcruxes. That's a level of magical knowledge that took decades to acquire and involved choices that cost you, whatever you were before you made them." He looked at the space where the presence was. "What was it like? Choosing that?" The temperature in the room dropped another degree. "No one has ever asked me that," said Voldemort. "No one who had the context to ask probably survived long enough to." He met what would have been Voldemort's gaze if Voldemort currently had a face. "You don't have to answer. I'm not asking to disarm you. I'm asking because I've spent 3 years studying the consequences and I'm interested in the decision." "You are very strange," said Voldemort. Not an insult. An observation, in the mode of someone who classified things and had found something that didn't fit existing categories. "I've been told that. I killed your parents. I know. And you're not afraid of me." "No. Most people who aren't afraid of me are either very powerful or very stupid," said Voldemort. You are 11 years old and you came through 6 magical protections to get here, which eliminates the second option. I had preparation and information, Harry said. Most of that was competence rather than power, if we're being accurate. And the power? Harry was quiet for a moment. Honest question, and the honest answer was, significant, and growing, and he was not going to lie about it or minimize it, because there was no tactical advantage in this room to pretending to be less than he was. Considerable, he said. More than I can fully use yet. I'm working on it. Quirrell made a sound. Harry looked at him and realized the man was sweating through his robes and his hands were shaking, and felt the actual sympathy deepen. Quirrell was in a situation he hadn't chosen in any meaningful way, had made one catastrophic decision in Albania that had cost him everything, and was now being used and discarded in stages. Let him go, Harry said to Voldemort. He is mine, said Voldemort, flatly. He's a person. Not well, not free, not happy, but a person. Let him go. And what do you offer in exchange? Nothing, Harry said. It's not a negotiation. Letting him go is the right thing and you should do it. That is not how I make decisions. I know. I'm making the case anyway. He looked at Quirrell, who was staring at him with an expression somewhere between desperate hope and the paralysis of someone who had stopped believing hope was available. You don't want this, Harry said to him directly. I know you don't. Whatever happened in Albania, this isn't what you chose. Quirrell made a sound that was not quite words. Don't speak to my host, said Voldemort, and his voice had changed now, gone sharp at the edges, a warning. You are very interesting, Potter, and I will not forget this conversation, but I will also not let the stone go tonight. Step aside. No, said Harry pleasantly. You cannot fight me. You don't have a body, Harry said. You're a fragment of a soul attached to a man who's half gone. I'm 11 and operating at probably 30% of my actual capacity because I've had 8 months of formal training. I think the arithmetic is interesting. Silence. Then, and it was unexpected enough that Harry's assessment recalibrated rapidly, Voldemort laughed. It was a thin sound, almost without humor, but there was something in it that was genuine. The reaction of someone who had not been surprised in a very long time and found the sensation of it interesting. You are James Potter's son, said Voldemort. He used to say things like that. In a room full of Death Eaters, wandless, he would say things that made the arithmetic interesting. The voice had changed again, and it was strange to hear something that approached reflection in it. He was very brave. He was, Harry agreed. He was also dead within 30 seconds. Yes. But you didn't have a body then either, and I know considerably more about your actual situation than he did. The mirror between them was reflecting Harry's image. He'd been careful not to look at it directly, keeping it in his peripheral vision, but he could see the general shape of what it showed him, and it was not what he might have expected from Miriam's description of the heart's most desperate desire. It was not his parents, though he thought of them and always would. It was not power or safety. It was a room. A very ordinary room, with bookshelves and a table and people in it who had chosen each other, and everyone was alive. He looked away from it. I'm going to make you a proposition, he said, to the space behind Quirrell's turban. You don't get the stone tonight. You don't get it at all, if I can help it, and I think I can help it considerably, because I intend to make sure Flamel is aware that his protection scheme has been compromised. That's happening regardless of anything else. What I'm offering is that I don't treat you as a problem to be eliminated. How generous, said Voldemort. I'm serious, Harry said. Dumbledore's plan, his original plan, was for me to die to destroy the Horcrux he believed was in me. To be a weapon that destroyed itself. He kept his voice level. That's not my plan. My plan involves a solution to the Horcrux problem that doesn't require anyone dying unnecessarily, and I've been researching it for 3 years and I have the beginning of an approach that might actually work. He paused. You want to exist. I understand that. The lengths you went to in order to exist were extreme, and they've cost you your ability to exist properly. The soul fracturing isn't sustainable. You know it isn't. Quiet. The fire flickered. You've been researching my Horcruxes, Voldemort said. Intensively. Why? Because they're the problem, Harry said, and I like solving problems. He kept his gaze steady. I'm not offering you a deal. I'm not asking for one. I'm telling you that the war as it was heading, me as a weapon, you as an adversary, everyone choosing sides and the casualties piling up, that's Dumbledore's war. I'm not interested in Dumbledore's war. And what are you interested in? Finishing it, he said. Properly. In a way that actually ends something rather than just postponing the next version. The room was very quiet. Quirrell was standing in his strange paralysis, breathing shallowly, sweat on his face. The mirror's enchanted surface shifted slightly. You are 11 years old, Voldemort said again, but the tone had changed. Not dismissive. Something closer to, fascinated, which was both flattering and deeply concerning. I'll be 12 in July, Harry said. I'm working quickly. And if I simply take Quirrell's hands and reach for you now? Direct contact with this form has consequences. Your mother's protection, my mother's protection is a love-based blood magic charm, Harry said. I know exactly what it does and how it works. It creates a barrier against the magical signature that killed her, specifically. If you fractured your soul 7 times in the interim, the signature of what you are now is different enough from what you were then that I'm genuinely uncertain whether it applies. He looked at Quirrell's hands. But trying it would tell both of us something interesting. Voldemort said nothing for a moment. You're gambling, he said. I'm making an accurate assessment of an uncertain variable and communicating it honestly. Harry paused. I'm not gambling. I'm saying I don't know. Those are different things. Another silence. Longer this time. Harry waited. He was patient in the way of someone who had spent years developing the ability to wait without losing the thread of what they were waiting for. The stone, said Voldemort finally, cannot give me what I need. No, Harry said. It can't. You said you have the beginning of an approach. I do. Which you are not going to tell me. Not tonight, Harry said. Not while you're attached to a man you're killing by degrees. You want me to let Quirrell go. I want you to stop using people as vessels, Harry said. That's a slightly larger ask. The fire in the chamber dimmed slightly, the way fires dim when something draws on the ambient energy of a room, and Harry felt the presence shift. Reassemble. There was something happening that he couldn't entirely read, which meant he tracked it carefully and held his position. You are a problem, said Voldemort, and it was the most purely neutral thing he'd said in the conversation, not a threat, not a compliment. An observation. The classifying voice again, placing Harry in a category and finding the category insufficient. Yes, Harry agreed. I will consider what you've said. That's all I'm asking. I'm not making any agreement. I know. I will still attempt to reconstitute myself. I know that too. Harry held his ground. I'm still going to work on the problem. Another pause. Then, queerness. Quirrell's body shuddered. Visibly, fully, the shudder of someone seized by something, and then released. He dropped to his knees, caught himself with both hands on the stone floor, and made a sound like someone surfacing from underwater. His hands were shaking badly. His turban was intact, but the quality of the presence in the room had changed, pulled back, reduced, no longer forward and pressing but retreated to whatever small dark space it existed in when it was not actively in Quirrell's consciousness. Quirrell looked up at Harry from the floor with red-rimmed eyes that were, for the first time, simply his own. He won't stay back for long, he said. His voice was his, the nervous scholar's voice, strained but genuine. He never does. I know, Harry said. Can you stand? I don't, I'm not sure. Harry crossed the chamber, keeping well clear of the mirror's direct line, and helped him to his feet. Quirrell's arm under his hands was thin as a bird's wing and shaking continuously. "You're going to need to go to Madame Pomfrey," Harry said. "And then to Amelia Bones, Director of Magical Law Enforcement. She needs to know what state you're in and what you can tell her. Can you do that?" He'll know. "He's going to know anyway," Harry said. "Whatever happens next, it's better than this." Quirrell looked at him with the eyes of someone who had spent months being stripped of their own selfhood and was now unexpectedly in possession of 2 minutes of it. "You're 11, he said. "People keep mentioning that," Harry said. "Come on." He walked Quirrell out of the chamber. The potions room, the chessboard, the pieces had reset but moved aside without challenge when Harry explained the situation aloud to them, which worked because of course it worked. This was a school and the pieces were enchanted with Hogwarts-level intelligence. The winged keys. The Devil's Snare corridor. The dog was still sleeping. Harry sent a silent thank you to whatever instinct had made him sustain the harp charm, and they moved past and into the corridor and Quirrell sank onto the floor against the wall. "I can go from here," he said. Harry looked at him. "Will you?" Quirrell met his gaze. "Yes," he said. Yes." Harry believed him, which was based on nothing more reliable than the assessment of someone who had been paying close attention to people for several years and had developed a reasonable working sense of when someone meant what they said. He believed him anyway. "Amelia Bones," he said. "As soon as possible." He turned and walked back toward the Gryffindor end of the corridor, toward the staircase that would take him back to the inhabited parts of the castle. His heart was doing something that was not quite fast but was definitely not slow. His hands were steady. He was cataloging the conversation in its entirety, which was going to take the rest of the evening and probably a letter to Miriam that was significantly longer than usual. He had just had a conversation with what remained of Voldemort in a chamber under a school and walked out of it. He was thinking about this in the specific way he thought about things that had gone differently than any scenario he'd prepared for. He hadn't prepared for Voldemort to be, like that. That complicated. That aware. That capable of something that moved through contempt and dismissal and arrived, briefly, at what had felt disturbingly close to genuine exchange. He hadn't prepared for the mirror to show him what it had. He hadn't prepared for feeling sorry for Quirinus Quirrell, but he had, and he did. He was almost at the staircase when he heard footsteps coming down fast, and then 3 figures appeared, Hermione first, Ron behind, and Anthony Goldstein slightly behind both, all of them breathing hard and wearing the combined expression of people who had made a decision and were committed to it and also extremely worried. Hermione stopped when she saw him. Her expression cycled through relief, fury, and a number of other things rapidly. "You went down there," she said. "I saw you go up to the 3rd floor and I went to Ron and we were coming, with Anthony." Harry said. "He was in the corridor," Ron said. "We didn't have time to explain." Anthony was looking at Harry with the focused attention he always had, which was the Ravenclaw version of Ron's loyal commitment to the motion once it was decided. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Harry said. "Quirrell is going to Madame Pomfrey. He needs someone to make sure he actually gets there and then contacts the ministry." "Can one of you?" "I'll go," Anthony said, immediately and without elaboration, which was why Harry had decided he was good people. Anthony went. Harry looked at Ron and Hermione. "The stone is safe for now," he said. "But Flamel needs to know his protection scheme has been accessed. That has to happen before morning." "I can write," Hermione started. "We need to tell McGonagall," Harry said. "Tonight. She needs the whole picture." Ron nodded. "Right. What happened down there?" Harry considered how to summarize it. "I talked to Voldemort," he said. Ron made a sound. He doesn't have a body. He was attached to Quirrell. He's diminished and fractured and," he stopped, because the next word was going to be interesting and he understood that Ron was not currently in a place to appreciate this assessment. "How are you not, shaking?" Ron said. "You talk to, and you're just, I'm processing," Harry said honestly. "The shaking, if it was going to happen, will happen later. Right now we need to see McGonagall." Hermione was looking at him with an expression that was thoughtful rather than alarmed. She had the specific quality of someone who would panic appropriately later and was currently in information-gathering mode, which he found genuinely reassuring. "Did it work? Whatever you were trying to do? The stone is still here. Quirrell is getting help." Voldemort retreated. He considered. "He's going to think about what I said." "What did you say?" "That I'm working on the problem," he said. "And that Dumbledore's war isn't my war." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you think he'll leave it? For now?" "I think he'll regroup," Harry said. "He's not gone and he's not going to stop. But tonight he chose to withdraw rather than fight, which means he's making some kind of calculation, and whatever the calculation is, it bought us time." He started walking toward McGonagall's office. "Time is what I need." "Time for what?" Ron said, falling into step. "To finish the research," Harry said. "And to be slightly more than 11. Ron looked at him sideways. "You know most 11-year-olds are not doing any of this." "I know," Harry said. "Does it ever bother you? That you have to?" He thought about it properly, because Ron had asked it properly, genuinely, with the warmth of someone who actually wanted to know and wasn't going to be managed with a deflection. "No," he said. "Because I chose it. He paused. "That's the whole point, actually. Someone tried very hard to make it so I had no choice. And because of Miriam and Amelia and Sirius and you and Hermione, I do have one. And I'm choosing this." He glanced at Ron. "That makes it different." Ron was quiet for a moment. Then, "Right," he said, in the tone of someone who had received something real and was holding it carefully. Hermione's hand found Harry's elbow briefly, a small contact, there and gone, which was her version of what Miriam's hand on his shoulder had been, and he recognized it as such. They walked the dark corridor toward McGonagall's office, and Harry thought about a chamber under the school and a mirror that had shown him a room with bookshelves and people in it who were alive. He thought about a fractured presence in a dying man's body, talking to him like something unprecedented had just occurred, which perhaps it had. He thought about what came next. It would have to be the Horcruxes. He'd known this for 3 years, but it was clearer now. There was no version of this that ended well unless the Horcruxes were dealt with, because Voldemort was right that he would keep reconstituting, keep finding vessels, keep pushing toward the stone or some equivalent, until he was whole enough to do it under his own power. The soul fracturing was the root of the problem. Everything else was symptom. He had the beginning of an approach. He'd been developing it since he was 8 years old in a ministry corridor, thinking about what it had felt like when Miriam and Thaddeus had removed 11 constructs from his own core, the precision of it, the way each one had come loose, the fundamental principle that dark magic embedded in a living magical system could be extracted without destroying the system if you understood the architecture. What was a Horcrux but dark magic embedded in an object? What was an object but a system? He needed 3 things: time, the right books, and someone who understood curse breaking at a level that went beyond field work into genuine theoretical mastery. He had one of those things. The second was a problem of access. The third was, he thought about Thaddeus Wren, who had said of the constructs in Harry's core, someone who understood the architecture at a deep level. He thought, I know who built the architecture. And I know someone who spent 20 years taking apart what that same person built in other objects. He thought, Dumbledore's trial concludes in December. He thought, that's not the right person. But Dumbledore's knowledge is on record now. The trial proceedings. The evidence. The theoretical frameworks he used. He thought, I'll need access to those records. He thought, Amelia. He filed it and kept walking. McGonagall's office was lit from within, which meant she was working late, which meant the news about Quirrell had perhaps already begun to travel. The castle had ways of moving information that had nothing to do with owls, or perhaps she simply always worked late in November. Harry knocked. "Come in," she said, and he did, and she looked up from her desk with the sharp attention of someone who had been expecting to be interrupted by something and was assessing whether this was it. She looked at Harry. She looked at Hermione and Ron behind him. She looked at the corridor beyond them, in the specific way of someone reconstructing what an evening looked like from its outputs. "Sit down," she said. "All three of you." "Mr. Potter," she looked at him. "What have you done?" "Kept the stone here," he said, sitting. "Bought us time. Made sure Quirrell is getting medical help." He met her gaze steadily. "I'm going to tell you everything that happened and then I need to contact Director Bones and Nicholas Flamel needs to be informed by morning." McGonagall's expression was the particular one he'd come to associate with her over 3 months, the expression of someone managing the simultaneous experience of being deeply worried and deeply impressed and refusing to let either one compromise the other. She folded her hands on her desk. "Tell me everything," she said. He did. Chapter 6, New Terms. Dumbledore's trial concluded on the 14th of December, 3 days before the end of Harry's first term at Hogwarts. Harry was not there in person. McGonagall had sent him a note on the morning of the 14th saying the verdict would be read at noon, and he'd spent that morning in double charms with the specific quality of focus that came from deliberately keeping his mind occupied so it wouldn't fixate on something he couldn't control. Flitwick was introducing them to charm stacking, the theory of layering multiple spells into a single sustained effect, and Harry worked through it with the full attention he could manage, which was considerable, and produced a result by the end of class that made Flitwick set down his clipboard and look at it for a long moment without speaking. "Mr. Potter," Flitwick said finally, "this is 7th-year work." "I had a lot of time over summer," Harry said. Said Flitwick, in the tone of someone who knew this was incomplete and was choosing to let it be. He made a note on his clipboard. He moved on. After class, Harry went to the library and sat at his usual table and opened a book he didn't read. Hermione came and sat across from him without speaking and opened her own book, which she did read, because she was better than him at compartmentalizing things she couldn't currently affect. At 12:30, an owl arrived in the library, which was technically against the rules, but the owl was small and precise and left no trace of itself except the letter it deposited on Harry's table and the single feather that drifted down after it. Amelia's handwriting. Heavy parchment. 4 lines. Guilty on all counts. Stripped of titles, wand snapped, 6 years Azkaban with possibility of early release on grounds of age and prior contribution, which I argued against and lost. Fudge got involved. The sentence is what it is, the conviction stands. That's what matters. He read it twice. Set it down. Looked at the library ceiling, which was vaulted stone and currently had a thin frost of enchanted light across it from the seasonal decorations McGonagall had approved. Guilty on all counts. Stripped of titles. Wand snapped. He thought about a chamber in the Ministry 2 years ago, Dumbledore's blue eyes finding his across the observer gallery. This isn't finished. And Harry's response, no. It's just starting. He thought, it's finished enough. Hermione looked up. She read his face, which she had gotten very good at over 3 months, and said nothing, just nodded once, which was her version of acknowledgement for something that didn't need words. He sent a reply to Amelia, "Thank you. I'll write more from home." He put the letter in his bag and went back to the book. He read it this time. The Hogwarts Express deposited him at King's Cross on the 17th and Miriam was on the platform, which was not unexpected, but Sirius was with her, which was, slightly, because Sirius had mentioned in his last letter that he was spending Christmas with an old order contact in Devon. He was clearly not spending Christmas in Devon. Harry came through the barrier with Ron. They'd shared a compartment the whole journey, playing chess and talking about nothing specific, which was the best possible use of a 6-hour train ride, and stopped when he saw them. Sirius had his hands in his coat pockets and his hair had grown out properly now, 2 years out of Azkaban, dark and slightly too long, and he looked approximately his actual age for the first time since Harry had known him. Ron went off to his family, enormous and loud and immediately enveloping, and Harry walked over. "Devon," he said to Sirius. "Plans changed," Sirius said. "When?" "When Amelia sent me the verdict." He looked at Harry with the grey eyes that were clearer than they'd been 2 years ago, whatever the Dementors had taken still not fully back but measurably more present month by month. "I wanted to be here. Is that all right?" Harry looked at him. "Yes," he said simply. They took Miriam's car, which was a practical and unremarkable Muggle vehicle that she drove with the focused competence she brought to most things. Harry sat in the back with his trunk and his owl. Hermione had given him the owl at the end of term, a small, extremely opinionated bird she'd found at Elops that she'd said reminded her of him, which he'd taken as a compliment, and watched London move past the window. Sirius had turned in the passenger seat and was looking at him. "Tell me about Quirrell," he said. They'd exchanged letters about the third-floor corridor, but letters were compressed. He'd given Amelia the full account, and Miriam the full account, and both of them had been to Hogwarts to speak with McGonagall, and the official version of events was that Quirrell had been discovered attempting to steal the Philosopher's Stone and had been taken to St. Mungo's in a critical condition from which, after 3 weeks, he was beginning to recover. The Voldemort element of events had been shared with Amelia and McGonagall and Miriam and Sirius in letters and no one else. "You've read the letter," Harry said. "I want to hear you say it," Sirius said. "What it was actually like." He thought about how to put it. He paused. "Tried again. Everything I'd read about him was accurate in the facts and wrong in the feeling. The books describe him as powerful, ruthless, obsessed with immortality. All of that is true. None of it." He looked out the window. "He was capable of something. In that room. I don't know what to call it exactly. He could have tried to take me. He chose not to." "Because you surprised him," Miriam said from the front, not taking her eyes off the road. "Partly," Harry said. "I think also because, he was thinking. He was genuinely thinking about what I said. Which is more dangerous than if he'd just attacked, because it means he's strategic about the long game, but it also means that there's something to work with," Sirius said. "Yes." He looked at Sirius. "The Horcruxes. That's the path. Not fighting him, not directly, not in the way every war plan I've read assumes. The Horcruxes are why he can't be permanently defeated by direct confrontation. If that's addressed first, the entire situation changes." Sirius was quiet for a moment. "You talked to him about this? In that room?" "I told him I was working on it." "And he didn't," he laughed, Harry said. Sirius stared at him. He laughed. "Not at me. More, at the situation. I think he found it genuinely unexpected. Someone telling him to his face, directly, that the path everyone assumes has to happen isn't the only one." Harry looked at his hands. "He said I was James's son." Sirius made a sound he quickly controlled. "What did you say?" "I agreed," Harry said. "And then I got Quirrell off the floor and walked him out." Miriam said nothing from the front seat, but something in her posture shifted, a settling, an exhale of tension she hadn't quite been showing. "You know," Sirius said, "when Dumbledore was planning all of this, the constructs, the positioning, the whole shape of it, he was building toward a final confrontation. The boy who lived against the Dark Lord, the chosen weapon against the enemy. A war with a specific ending baked into it from the start." He looked at Harry. "You are doing something so different from that I don't think you would recognize it as the same situation." "It isn't the same situation," Harry said. "He created a situation. I'm creating a different one." "Yes," Sirius said. "You are." They drove the rest of the way in comfortable quiet, and the city thinned into suburbs and the suburbs thinned into the particular green and grey of the English winter, and Harry leaned his head against the window and felt the owl shift on his knee and thought about the Horcrux problem from the angle he'd been approaching it since October. He had, now, the full trial records. Amelia had sent them, 300 pages of evidence documentation, including Dumbledore's own testimony about the theoretical framework he'd used to construct the 11 control Horcruxes. It was, stripped of its horrifying context, an extraordinary piece of magical theory. Dumbledore understood the architecture of dark magic at a level that very few practitioners had ever achieved, and in the trial he'd explained it with the detached precision of someone who had fully separated the knowledge from its applications. Harry had read those sections 6 times and made careful notes and cross-referenced them against Thaddeus's technical observations from the removal procedure and against the 3 texts on Horcrux theory that existed in Hogwarts' restricted section, which McGonagall had given him access to with a permission note that was so brief it suggested she'd written it quickly before she could second-guess herself. He had, he believed, the outlines of an approach. Not fully formed. Not ready. But the shape of it was there. What he needed next was Thaddeus. Christmas at Miriam's house was the same as all the previous ones and therefore exactly what he needed. The kitchen table. The apple tree outside, bare now and pleasantly skeletal against the winter sky. Sirius stayed, sleeping in the spare room with the ease of someone who had spent enough time in this house to have an opinion about which mug was the best mug. On the 23rd, Harry was sitting at the kitchen table after dinner with his notes spread out around him and the trial records open at the theoretical sections when Sirius dropped into the chair across from him. He looked at the spread of notes. He was one of the few people who could look at Harry's working and follow it quickly. "You've gone further than I thought you had," he said. "I've had time over term," Harry said. "And the restricted section texts were useful." Sirius turned one of the pages toward him. He read for a moment. He looked up. "You're theorizing that the Horcrux architecture can be reversed using a modified version of what Miriam did on your core." "Modified significantly," Harry said. "The constructs in me weren't true Horcruxes, they didn't contain a soul piece. That changes the procedure fundamentally. But the underlying principle, that dark magic embedded in a magical system can be extracted without destroying the system, that holds." He turned to the relevant section of his notes. "The difficulty with a true Horcrux is the soul piece. You can't just extract it the way you extract a construct because it's integrated at a deeper level. It has a relationship with the object's magical identity. So how do you extract it?" "You don't extract it," Harry said. "You dissolve the connection. The soul piece and the anchor, the object, are bound by a specific act of dark magic that essentially overwrites the object's natural magical state. If you can reverse the overwrite, the soul piece loses its anchor and disperses." Sirius looked at him. "And you know how to reverse the overwrite?" "I have the beginning of a theoretical framework for it," Harry said carefully. "I need Thaddeus. I need to sit down with him and go through it properly, because the practical application is going to require curse-breaking skill at a level I don't have yet. But you'll have it. In a few years, with the right work, yes." He met Sirius's gaze. "I'm not planning to do this at 11. I'm planning to spend the next several years developing the theory fully and building the practical ability. By the time Voldemort is strong enough to be a genuine active threat again, you'll be ready," Sirius said. "I'll be ready," Harry agreed. Sirius sat with this for a moment. Outside the window the garden was dark, frost on the grass, the apple tree making its winter silhouette. "What about the Horcrux in you?" he said carefully. "Or, the one Dumbledore thought was in you." Harry had thought about this. "There isn't one," he said. "Or rather, the scar carries a trace of Voldemort's magical signature from the night he tried to kill me. It's not a true Horcrux, it's a resonance, a remnant. Miriam confirmed this when she did the removal procedure and I've verified it in the trial records. Dumbledore believed there was a soul piece there. He was wrong." He paused. "Or he was right that there was something there and wrong about what it was." The distinction matters. Because if it's a resonance rather than a soul piece, it can be addressed differently. The scar might actually be useful. It's a direct connection to Voldemort's magical signature, which means when he's in a physical form again it will function as a kind of tracking mechanism. He said this with the tone of someone who had found the silver lining in something deeply inconvenient. It hurts when he's nearby or when he's experiencing strong emotion. In the third-floor corridor it was, he touched the scar briefly. Uncomfortable. But readable. I could feel his state through it. Sirius was quiet for a long moment. Your parents would be, he stopped, because the sentence was going too many directions at once. He chose one. Your mum would be absolutely terrifying if she could see what you're doing with her protection charm. In the best way. She'd be furious you were in danger and she'd also immediately start trying to advance the theory. Harry smiled. It was easy, which it hadn't always been, which he still noticed and was glad of. And my dad? James would be challenging you to a duel every other day to keep up with you and losing approximately half the time and being delighted about it. He said it with the specific quality of someone walking carefully through a field they love that is also full of grief. He was like that. He was, the best of us, in terms of genuine response to other people's competence. He never wanted you to be smaller so he could feel bigger. Harry thought about this for a while. Tell me something about them I haven't read, he said. Sirius looked at him. This was not a new request. Harry had been making it in various forms for 2 years, drawing the full picture from Sirius's memory because records and documents were incomplete and Sirius was the most direct line to the specific living texture of who James and Lily had been. Your mum, Sirius said, settling back, used to argue with Dumbledore. He said it with a particular satisfaction. Not constantly, not about everything. But she had a quality, she'd listen to the full argument, take it seriously, and then say, very quietly, but have you considered that you might be wrong? And Dumbledore wasn't used to it. He'd go very still when she did it. Like someone who has a very refined reflex and is suddenly in the presence of something that doesn't trigger it. He paused. I think that's part of why what he did was not about love, whatever he claimed. But I think she specifically unsettled something in him. She saw through the presentation in a way that most people couldn't or wouldn't. And he put constructs in her son, Harry said. Not bitterly. Just naming it. Yes. She would have taken the ministry apart with her bare hands, Harry said. Metaphorically, Sirius said. She was also a rule follower, your mum. Deeply. She believed in institutions. She just also believed they should be held to account. He paused. She'd have found Amelia Bones and she'd have made her do it right. She wouldn't have done it outside the system. She'd have used the system and made it work. Harry thought about this. That's what we did. Yes, Sirius said. It is. On the 27th of December Harry sat across a desk from Thaddeus Wren in Thaddeus's very organized home office and showed him the notes. Thaddeus read them the same way he did everything, completely, in order, without commentary, to the end. He set them down. He picked up his tea. He put it back. He picked up the notes and read several sections again. The dissolution methodology, he said. Yes. This is, he stopped. Where did you get the theoretical base for the overwrite reversal? Dumbledore's trial testimony. The sections about the construct architecture. And cross-referenced with Horcrux theory from 3 restricted section texts. He paused. And what I remembered from the removal procedure. The way each construct felt when it came loose. I've been thinking about that for 7 years. Thaddeus looked at him over the notes. He had the specific expression of someone encountering something that requires them to update their existing model. You remembered what it felt like from the inside. Clearly enough to work with, yes. You were 4 years old. Memory construct was removed third. Everything after that consolidated normally. Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. He looked at the notes again. This is viable, he said. As a theoretical framework. The practical application is going to be significant. The skill level required for the dissolution step is beyond anything in current curse-breaking practice. Someone would have to develop it. I know, Harry said. That's what the next several years are for. You're going to train as a curse-breaker. I'm going to train in everything relevant, Harry said. Curse-breaking, arithmancy, advanced charms, spell creation. He held Thaddeus's gaze. I'm going to need help. Thaddeus looked at him. He set the notes down. He looked at them. He picked up his tea and actually drank it this time. I'm not a teacher, he said. I know. I'm not asking for a teacher. I'm asking for a collaborator. Thaddeus considered this at his characteristic length. Summers, he said finally. School holidays. Correspondence during term. That's all I need, Harry said. Thaddeus picked up the notes again and made a small mark in the margin of page 7, which was the closest thing to enthusiasm Harry had ever seen from him, and said, the dissolution step on page 12 has an error in the energy calculation. I know, Harry said. I couldn't work out the right value. It's not a value problem. The equation is structured wrong. Here, he picked up a quill and began to write, and Harry leaned forward and they spent the next 3 hours going through it, and the kitchen clock moved from 2 to 5 and Thaddeus's wife brought them sandwiches at some point and they ate them without noticing, and by the time the winter afternoon had gone fully dark outside the window they had filled 12 pages of new notes and the equation on page 12 was right. January returned him to Hogwarts on a morning that was bright and brittle, the kind of January morning that didn't apologize for being cold. The Hogwarts Express arrived just after lunch and the castle's wards met him as he came through the gates, the familiar pulse of old magic that had become, over one term, something like a greeting. Ron was already halfway through a story about Christmas at the Burrow. His grandfather had exploded a Muggle device while trying to understand it. There had been a large and thoroughly attended argument about Quidditch that had somehow ended with everyone crying and laughing simultaneously. Percy had given a speech nobody asked for, and Ginny had hexed Fred, which appeared to be entirely deserved. Harry listened with the specific pleasure of someone hearing about a family that was very different from anything he'd known and finding it wonderful rather than alienating. Hermione had spent Christmas in France with her parents and had read 14 books and was about to tell him about all of them, which he was also genuinely looking forward to. He settled back into the rhythm of Hogwarts as if he'd never left. The thing about the rhythm was that it was right. Academically, it was stretching rather than challenging. He was ahead of the curriculum in most subjects and working at an entirely different level in a few, but the social texture of it, the daily structure of it, the specific quality of being in a community of young people who were mostly trying to figure out who they were, was something he'd never had before and found continuously interesting. Draco Malfoy had done what Harry had predicted, spent 2 weeks being angry and then started thinking. His third approach to Harry, in late January, had none of the rehearsed script quality of the first one. He'd come to the library and sat across from Harry, which took something, because Malfoy's social architecture did not usually accommodate that kind of move. He'd said, "I've been thinking about what you said." "I know," Harry said. "You don't know what I've been thinking." "I know you've been thinking." "The what, tell me." Malfoy had been quiet for a moment, which was new, and then said, "My father says Dumbledore's conviction is bad for certain interests. I've been trying to work out what that means." "What interests? And why?" He looked at Harry with pale grey eyes that were, when the performance was stripped off, quite sharp. "I think he owes people. I think there are people who benefited from the way things were arranged. The way Dumbledore arranged them." "Yes," Harry said. "And those people are going to regroup," Harry said. "Yes." Malfoy looked at him. "You already know all of this." "I've been thinking about it since I was 8, Harry said. "That's not," Malfoy stopped. "Start it again." "My father was a Death Eater," he said, and it came out with the quality of something that had been contained under pressure for a long time and was not going to be contained any longer. He says he was controlled. Imperious. I don't know if that's true. I don't either, Harry said honestly. I'd need to see the evidence. That's a very lawyerly response. I'm not a lawyer. But I believe in evidence. He held Malfoy's gaze. What do you want, Draco? The use of the first name landed. Malfoy was quiet for a moment, doing something behind his face that Harry recognized as the recalculation of someone who had been given a new variable. I want to know which side I'm on, Malfoy said finally, in a voice stripped of all the practiced quality. Genuine. Uncomfortable. Young in a way that his performance never was. That's the right thing to want to know, Harry said. Figure out what you actually believe is right. Not your family. You. He paused. Then the side isn't a choice, it's just where you already are. Malfoy had looked at him for a long moment. He'd left without saying anything else. But he'd come back to the library 3 days later and asked Harry what he was reading, and Harry had told him, and they'd talked about it for an hour, and something had shifted in the careful managed architecture of Draco Malfoy that Harry thought was the first brick of something that might eventually look like an actual person. He filed it. He kept going. The letter from Azkaban arrived in March, which was surprising only in that it arrived at all. Harry was in the common room when the owl came, an unfamiliar one, plain and grey, and he took the letter and looked at the seal and understood immediately who it was from. He sat with it for a moment, aware of the weight of it, and then opened it. Mr. Potter, I have requested this correspondence be permitted on grounds of ongoing legal proceedings. You may verify with Director Bones if you wish. I have had considerable time to think, which is the primary occupation available here. I have been thinking about what you said at the Wisengamot, and what you said at the session, and what I understand, from sources which still reach me, you have been doing since. I made choices that I believe were necessary. I still believe they were necessary. I am aware that you disagree and that your disagreement is not without logic. I am also aware that you are doing things now that suggest the necessity I perceived may have been, in some respects, overstated. I am not writing to apologize. I don't believe an apology is what you need from me, and I suspect you agree. I am writing because there is knowledge in my possession, specific knowledge about the Horcrux architecture, about Voldemort's history, about the location of certain objects, that would be useful to you and that will not survive indefinitely in Azkaban. I am willing to share it. Not as a bargain. Not as a condition of anything. Simply because it is relevant and you are the person most likely to do something productive with it. If you choose to come, I will answer your questions completely. If you choose not to, I will understand. Albus Dumbledore. Harry read it twice. He folded it precisely. He put it in his bag. He sat for a moment in the common room with the evening light coming through the windows and thought about all the possible responses to this letter and what each of them meant. He thought about what it would cost him to go. Not in terms of difficulty, Amelia could arrange the visit, the logistics were manageable. In terms of what it would mean. To sit in a room with the man who had put 11 constructs in him at 11 days old and ask him questions and receive the answers. He thought, that man has information I need. He thought, needing something from someone who wronged you is not the same as forgiving them, and it is not the same as condoning what they did, and it does not require either of those things. He thought, I am not afraid of him. He wrote to Amelia and asked her to arrange a visit. Azkaban was on an island in the North Sea and was, even in April, aggressively cold. The Dementors had been removed from the perimeter, Amelia's decision, following a reform package that Harry knew she'd been building since the Sirius Black case had exposed how much the Ministry had been willing to let slide, and replaced with a layered ward system that was considerably more effective and didn't cause lasting psychological damage to everyone inside it. The visiting room was plain stone and a table and 2 chairs. Harry sat in one. He waited. Dumbledore came in with a guard who remained by the door. He was wearing prison robes and he had no wand, the snapping of a wand was not reversible, was a sentence carried in the body for the rest of a life, and he was thin in a way that suggested Azkaban had cost him things even without the Dementors. But he walked to the chair and sat in it and folded his hands on the table and looked at Harry, and the blue eyes were still the blue eyes. Still layered and old and extraordinarily alert. "Thank you for coming," Dumbledore said. "I needed information," Harry said. "Let's not make it more than it is." Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. "Very well." He settled. "What do you want to know?" "Horcrux locations. All of them you're aware of?" "I know of 5 with certainty and have strong theories about 2 more." He listed them. Harry wrote them down in a notebook without looking up. The locket, the cup, the diadem, the diary, already destroyed, which Harry noted, the snake. The ring. Voldemort himself. "The ring has a curse on the stone," Dumbledore said. "Do not touch the stone with bare skin. It's designed to spread to the handler's magical core and is fatal within months." Harry wrote this down. "The diary was destroyed by basilisk venom," Dumbledore continued. "Which leads to the question of what can destroy a Horcrux. Basilisk venom. Fiend fire. Any force powerful enough to destroy the object beyond magical repair before the protective enchantments can rebuild it. The soul piece requires only that the anchor be destroyed." "I'm working on a different approach," Harry said. Dumbledore paused. "I know. I've heard something of it. Dissolution rather than destruction." "Yes. The theoretical challenge is, the overwrite reversal," Harry said. "I've addressed the energy calculation with Thaddeus Wren. The framework is viable." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "You are working on extracting the soul piece without destroying the object." "Yes." "Why does it matter whether the object is destroyed?" Harry looked up from his notebook for the first time. He met Dumbledore's gaze directly. "Because some of the objects are people," he said. Silence. "The snake," Dumbledore said slowly. "And Voldemort himself. The soul piece in him is the last one, the one that was meant to stay whole. It's also fractured because of the Horcrux creation process, which means the dissolution approach applies to it too." He held Dumbledore's gaze. "Your plan required Harry Potter to die to eliminate the Horcrux in him. I've established that there is no Horcrux in me, it's a resonance, not a soul piece. But even if there had been, destruction isn't the only option. Dissolution is survivable." Dumbledore's expression was doing something complicated. The layered composure was still there, but underneath it something was moving, not guilt exactly, still not that, but something adjacent to it. The specific face of a man whose fundamental assumptions are being dismantled in real time. "I planned for 50 years, he said. "For a specific outcome." "I know," Harry said. "And you are 12 years old and you have found another way." "I'm almost 12, Harry said. "And I had help. And access to information you worked hard to keep from me, which, when it became available, turned out to make the problem considerably more solvable." He kept his voice even. "That's actually worth noting, I think. The information that made it solvable was the information you were suppressing. Withholding it didn't make the problem harder to solve. It just made it harder for the right person to solve it." Dumbledore looked at his hands. "The constructs," he said. "In you." "Yes. I believed," he stopped. He started again, and the version he started with was different, stripped of the scaffolding of justification. "I needed you to be willing to die. The prophecy indicated a final sacrifice was the path to Voldemort's defeat. I made you, cultivated you to be, ready for that sacrifice." He was quiet. "I understand now that the sacrifice is not necessary." "It wasn't necessary then either," Harry said. "The prophecy says the power he knows not. It doesn't specify what that power is. You assumed it meant death magic, the protection my mother created. But the power Voldemort doesn't know is," he paused, choosing the word carefully. Choice. Genuine, free, unconstrained choice. Every decision he makes is motivated by fear of death and need for power. He doesn't understand the decisions that come from something else. He met Dumbledore's eyes. You almost made me like him. A person whose choices were managed by someone else's plan. The power he knows not would have been the same in both of us. Dumbledore was very still. That is, he said finally, the most accurate analysis of this situation that I have encountered. I know, Harry said. I did not think, I could not see past my own certainty, Harry said. You were very certain. You'd been right about so many things for so long that you stopped leaving room for the possibility of being wrong. He didn't say it with anger. He said it the way he'd planned to say it for a very long time, which was cleanly and precisely and without the weight of grievance, because grievance was not what he'd come here with. I'm not here because I haven't forgiven you. I'm here because you have information I need and I'm practical enough to come and get it. Dumbledore looked at him. Have you forgiven me? Harry considered this honestly. I don't know, he said. I'm 12. I think it might be too early for me to know what that feels like. What I know is that I don't hate you and I'm not afraid of you and I needed you to understand, from me directly, what the actual situation is. Now you do. He picked up his notebook. What else can you tell me about the Horcrux locations that I haven't asked about? Dumbledore told him. The conversation lasted another hour and a quarter, and Harry filled 9 more pages of his notebook, and when it was done he stood and picked up his bag and looked at Dumbledore one final time. The old man was sitting in his chair at the table in the plain stone room, wandless, wearing prison robes, thinner than his portraits had ever made him, and he was looking at Harry with an expression that was the most uncomplicated thing Harry had ever seen on his face, no performance, no management, no architecture of presentation. He just looked like a very old man who had made a very long mistake and was sitting with the full weight of it for perhaps the first time. Will you tell me one thing? Dumbledore said. Harry waited. Do you think it can be done? What you're planning? The dissolution. An end to this without what I planned for. Harry thought about 9 pages of notes and Thaddeus's margin corrections and the framework that was still developing but was real, was genuinely real, was not a hopeful sketch but a working theory backed by solid principles and a growing body of practical knowledge. He thought about a mirror in a chamber under a school that had shown him a room full of living people. He thought about Voldemort in that chamber, retreating. Choosing to withdraw. Making a calculation. He thought about the conversation they'd had and what it meant that it had been a conversation at all. Yes, he said. I think it can be done. Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them they were still blue, still layered, but something in them had settled. Something that had been held tight for a very long time releasing in a very small way. Good, he said. Good. Harry went out. The boat back to the mainland cut through grey water and cold air and Harry sat in the bow with his notebook in his lap and his hands wrapped around a thermos of tea that the guard had wordlessly given him before they embarked. He watched the island shrink behind them and thought about all of it, and then he deliberately stopped thinking about all of it and thought instead about what came next. June. End of first year. Summer with Miriam and Sirius, months of work with Thaddeus, the theory developing toward practice, a list of Horcrux locations in a notebook, a list of things he now knew and things he still needed to learn. Second year in September. He'd have a year's understanding of Hogwarts now, a year's worth of relationships, a year's development in the areas he was focusing on. He was going to take on arithmancy and ancient runes in third year, both relevant to the dissolution framework, and he wanted to get ahead in both over summer. Sirius had mentioned, carefully, that he might be interested in taking on a more formal role in whatever was developing. Not as a guardian, Miriam was that, and they had found their particular balance over 8 years and it was good. But as, the word Sirius had used was partner, in the way James had been his partner, which Harry had understood to mean, someone who was in it with him, not behind him or above him but beside him. He'd said yes. He'd said it immediately, before Sirius could finish formulating the offer, which had made Sirius do the good laugh. The mainland appeared, gray and green in the distance. The boat moved toward it steadily. Harry thought, there is a lot to do. He thought, I have time to do it. He thought, I have people. This, of all of it, was still the one that caught him sometimes. Not the power was just himself, was what he'd always been, was the thing that had been there under 11 chains waiting to be let out. Not the knowledge was the product of years and work and would keep growing. Not the plan, which was real and viable and his own. The people. Miriam, who had looked at a diagnostic scan and decided not to look away. Sirius, who had spent 7 years in Azkaban and come out and laughed at the first opportunity and called him a controlled explosion with complete affection. Thaddeus, who made margin corrections in theory notes at 5 in the afternoon and called it collaboration. Hermione, who had sat across from him in a train compartment and talked about philosophy and meant all of it. Ron, who had asked does it bother you with the tone of someone who genuinely needed to know and received the honest answer and held it carefully. Anthony, who had said yes, I think I might to an implied question about commitment and walked away to find Quirrell in a hospital corridor without being asked a second time. McGonagall, who had written him a letter before he arrived and told him both that she had high expectations and that she would treat him like a person, and had kept both promises. And in the strange, complicated, categorically unprecedented column, Voldemort in a chamber under a school, retreating when he didn't have to, making a calculation that included something other than brute force. Harry did not know what Voldemort would do next. He didn't have a clear read on the calculation, and he wouldn't claim to. But he knew what he was doing next, and he knew the people who would be doing it alongside him, and that was a better position than Dumbledore had ever planned for him. The boat touched the dock. He got out. He took the train back to London. He came through the door of Miriam's house at 6 in the evening and she was in the kitchen and Sirius was at the table with wine and the newspaper, and the kitchen smelled like whatever Miriam was making and the apple tree was visible through the window catching the last of the evening light. Sirius looked up when he came in. Well? Harry set his bag down and hung up his coat. 9 pages of Horcrux locations and associated notes, he said. A confirmed approach to the ring curse. A methodology correction I need to work through with Thaddeus. And? Miriam said. And nothing. That's what I came for. That's what I got. Sirius looked at him for a moment. He seemed to be reading something in Harry's posture or face, in the particular quality of how he was standing in the kitchen doorway. He nodded, once, which was his version of the thing Miriam did with her hand on Harry's shoulder. Sit down, Miriam said. Dinner in 10 minutes. Harry sat. He opened his notebook and looked at 9 pages of information that was going to be relevant in the years ahead. He made a small note in the margin about the ring curse approach. He looked at Thaddeus's earlier correction on page 12 of the original framework and added a thought that the Azkaban conversation had sparked. Sirius said something to Miriam about an article in the newspaper. Miriam said something back that made Sirius make a noise that was almost argument and was clearly not serious. The kitchen had its familiar warm smell and the familiar light and the apple tree outside was holding the last of the evening the way apple trees did in spring, catching all the gold it could before the dark. Harry wrote his note and closed the notebook and looked up. What's in the newspaper? He said. Sirius turned it around. The prophet thinks Fudge is going to make a statement about magical creature rights and everyone thinks it'll be rubbish, he said. As usual. Is it rubbish? Probably. You want to write a strongly worded letter to someone? Not tonight, Harry said. Tomorrow. Possibly, Harry said, which made Sirius grin, the full one, the good one, the one that had been getting more like itself month by month for 2 years. Miriam set plates on the table. She looked at Harry, which was not the diagnostic look and not the guardian look but the specific look she'd had for a while now that he'd decided to just accept meant she was fond of him in a way neither of them was going to make into a speech. He looked back. This was his version of the same thing. Outside, the spring evening moved through its paces. Somewhere over the city a pair of owls crossed each other's paths in the darkening sky. The world carried on being itself, enormous and complicated and full of things that were not finished yet but were being worked on by people who had decided they were the right people to work on them. Harry picked up his fork and Sirius told him something ridiculous that had happened at the ministry and Miriam argued with the newspaper, and Harry laughed, genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh that came from the right place, the place that had been silent for the first 4 years of his life and had never been silent since. It was a good sound. It always had been. He just hadn't known it until now.